December 2021. A heavy atmosphere enveloped Cloquet Valley State Forest, more than 30 miles from Duluth, Minnesota. The beam from a hunter's flashlight cut through the frigid darkness that had accumulated for 3 decades, illuminating something no one was ever meant to find. Central, I need backup at Cloquet Valley and send forensic investigators immediately. His voice echoed through the ice-covered pine trees as if awakening the ghost of an old disappearance. What began as a routine check of hunting trails after reports of unusual animal tracks had now become something entirely different. Something that would touch the simmering pain Duluth had carried for 31 years. A human bone fragment lay exposed in the frozen ground, and right beside it was a small silver pendant engraved with the initials LH. From that moment, the questions that had haunted the Houghton family and the Duluth community rose up with fierce intensity. Where did Laura go? Who brought her into this forest? And what really happened on the route she took to work that day? For more than 3 decades, Laura's disappearance had left only unanswered voids, a bone-chillingly cold morning, a familiar commute to Lakeview pet boarding, then absolute silence, an empty chair at every family dinner, a bedroom her mother could never bring herself to clear out. Before we continue this haunting story, please take a second to hit subscribe and like the video. Your support helps us bring forgotten cases back into the light, and the algorithm will make sure you never miss any future parts. The discovery in Cloquet Valley was not just the end of a 31-year search. It was the first domino in a chain of events that would expose secrets buried deep in this small northern Minnesota community. Because when authorities finally connected the old evidence, a glove dropped on the old Thompson Trail, strange mud on a pair of boots, and the vague sighting of a red 1990 pickup truck, to the bone fragment that was found, they realized the truth had never disappeared. It had simply been lying under the snow. And when the suspect was identified, it wasn't a stranger or a random predator. It was someone the community had known, trusted, and stood beside at Laura's memorials for years, looking her family straight in the eye with chilling calm. The Houghton case is not just a mystery solved. It is proof of her family's perseverance, of investigators who refused to let the file fade into oblivion, and of the power of modern forensic science, mitochondrial DNA, microfiber analysis, and forest-penetrating LiDAR. Technologies that finally gave voice to someone silenced for over 30 years. It is also the story of a community that was once torn apart. When Laura vanished in 1990, suspicion spread through Duluth like wildfire in dry timber. Neighbors eyed each other warily. Close families grew distant. Those simmering cracks would eventually explode when the truth was pulled up from beneath the ice of time. What makes this case especially haunting is that the answer was always so close. The suspect had been questioned, had appeared in the original investigation files, but had slipped through the net. For 3 decades, that person lived among the community as an ordinary citizen, hiding unimaginable secrets. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I want to know how far these stories travel and how they connect us. Tonight, we'll retrace Laura's final steps in December 1990 and follow the decades-long investigation that led to this shocking turning point. This is a story of loss, persistence, deception, and ultimately justice delayed, but not denied. On a December morning in 1990, the Duluth suburbs were blanketed in fresh snow, the characteristic winter stillness of northern Minnesota settling over the log homes and roads leading toward Lake Superior. Laura Houghton, who lived in a small house near the edge of the city, left home for Lakeview pet boarding, the pet care facility she had run for years, as she did every day. Duluth in the bitter cold always started slowly, and Laura's regular appearance at the facility was something everyone took for granted. She was never late, never missed a shift, even on the harshest weather days. So when the facility's doors remained closed after staff arrived later, it immediately raised alarm. There were no signs of activity inside, no client vehicles, no barking dogs, no indication that Laura had opened up and prepared for the workday. Staff thought she might be stuck, due to the weather, or had a minor issue on the road, but as hours passed without Laura showing up, worry grew. The family, accustomed to speaking with her every morning, became concerned when calls went unanswered. They reached out to friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen Laura on her way to the facility, but everyone confirmed they hadn't seen her since she left home early that morning. The prolonged silence spread unease. The phone rang with no answer. The facility stayed locked, and Laura, reliable, punctual, and rarely deviating from her schedule, seemed to have vanished completely in the short distance between home and work. When the final calls went unanswered, the family realized Laura's absence was no longer an ordinary delay, but a genuinely alarming sign. Unable to wait any longer, they decided to report it to the authorities. The report of Laura's unusual disappearance was received immediately and entered into the official missing person protocol. At the duty desk, the officer on duty opened the reporting form and asked the family for the initial identifying details: height, weight, hair color, distinguishing features, the type of winter coat she usually wore, health conditions, and any other identifying marks that could aid the search. Family members said Laura typically wore a thick navy blue coat, habitually tied her hair in a high ponytail for work, wore little jewelry, and carried a small bag dedicated to pet care duties. They also provided the license plate and description of the vehicle Laura drove daily, an important detail for police to verify whether the car was at the location she was supposed to be. After collecting this basic data, police cross-referenced the daily routine described by the family. Laura habitually arrived at Lakeview Pet Boarding early every morning, opening before the assistant staff arrived. Her failure to be there at that time was unprecedented and instantly heightened police concern. They asked about any recent changes in routine, family issues, personal conflicts, or work pressure that might explain unusual behavior, but the family insisted Laura showed no signs of wanting to alter her schedule or leave without notice. The winter weather that year was also scrutinized closely by police. Duluth in December often saw temperatures drop to dangerous lows, combined with heavy snow that made travel hazardous even for locals. A person going missing in such freezing conditions could mean life-threatening risk if they had a vehicle breakdown injury, became lost, or couldn't find shelter. Thus, the environmental factor not only increased the case's severity, but also affected evidence collection, as snow easily covered any traces of movement. Additionally, police noted that adult disappearances can sometimes be explained by non-criminal reasons, leaving voluntarily, going somewhere without telling anyone, or needing a break from work. However, in Laura's case, all those theories contradicted the information provided. She had no appointments other than work, no plans to leave Duluth, and no signs of emotional distress or desire to disconnect from family. Police continued asking about people Laura regularly interacted with: coworkers, friends, neighbors, regular pet boarding clients. They also considered who might have seen her before she left home, right as she walked out the door, or along the route to work. Yet information from family and neighbors showed no one had directly witnessed Laura's journey after she left her driveway that morning. The complete lack of confirmed sightings of where she went heightened the case's uncertainty. At this point, Duluth PD conducted an initial risk assessment based on 3 factors: the sudden change in routine, life-threatening weather conditions, and inability to contact the victim over an extended period. Combined, these led police to conclude Laura's case could not be treated as a routine absence. The file was marked "Suspicious Missing Person," activating a more urgent initial verification process. This process included checking her residence, verifying her usual route, gathering information on possible stops, and assessing whether the disappearance involved a sudden incident or unforeseen danger. This classification placed Laura's case in the rapid response category because the longer it went, the lower the chances of collecting initial evidence due to weather and environmental impact. While finalizing the file, investigators also defined initial scope, searching areas Laura might have passed through before disappearing, cross-checking family and witness information to determine the last point she may have been present, and deciding the appropriate investigative direction based on recorded objective factors. Though no evidence yet confirmed what happened, police knew the time immediately following a missing person report is always the most critical for verifying the reported individual's safety. As the initial verification process rolled out, the first place police went was Lakeview Pet Boarding, where Laura was expected early. Snow still covered the parking lot and entrance when the patrol team arrived, and from the outside they immediately noted the building's total silence. There were no signs the door had been unlocked, no evidence of any pet care activity, and none of the usual morning animal sounds staff said were normal when Laura started the day. The front door was locked in the position used when the facility was closed, the hours sign was untouched, and the snow on the front steps showed no footprints or shoveling. This indicated no one had entered or exited before police arrived. Based on staff statements that Laura was always the first to arrive and prepare the facility, the fact the door remained locked and no preparation had occurred was clear proof she had not come to work at all that morning. Laura's vehicle was also absent from the parking lot, leading police to conclude that if she had left home as usual, she never reached her intended destination. They checked around the building to document the scene. Snow at the side entrance was undisturbed. Outdoor kennels showed no use that day, and the back door was locked from the inside. Police noted that the lack of activity only reinforced their initial conclusion that Laura disappeared en route to work, not after arriving. To complete this verification step, they contacted later shift staff. All confirmed they had received no schedule change notice from Laura, and that her absence from opening was alarming to the point of warranting a report. When compiling observations, police determined the area around Lakeview Pet Boarding was the next priority survey zone. The surrounding terrain included a fairly large parking lot, a strip of trees connecting to forest behind the facility, and a small road leading to a sparsely populated residential area on the other side. This zone required thorough checking, as it could reveal the first clues about Laura's movement if she had gotten close to the facility before vanishing. The fact the facility was never opened showed no signs of her stopping or being present, and had no direct witnesses seeing her arrive, strengthened the hypothesis that the disappearance point lay in the short distance from her home to the facility. Immediately after confirming Lakeview Pet Boarding was not where Laura appeared the morning she went missing, police moved to the next step in handling a suspicious disappearance, expanding the search around the facility area. Duluth PD patrol units coordinated with St. Louis County support to sweep the entire nearby radius, starting from the parking lot, the main road into the facility, and small paths leading to the forest edge behind. In the winter weather conditions at the time, the search faced major obstacles. Thick snow covered the ground, erasing any possible early traces, and constant cold wind blurred any footprints or skid marks that might have existed. Officers noted that information about movement, vehicles, or unusual activity in the area was virtually non-existent, making it nearly impossible to accurately read the snow surface for signs of travel. Nevertheless, the search team systematically covered each zone using a grid method along trails cutting behind the facility, around large tree trunks, beside wooden fences, and transition areas between pavement and open ground. Another team checked the front of the facility, where a small road led to the sparse residential area. They looked for signs like dropped items, unusual skids, displaced snow patches, but everything was completely covered by fresh snowfall and wind. Denser wooded sections were examined more closely because they might shield traces from being erased by snow, but the results yielded nothing useful. No fabric scraps, shoe prints, personal items, or any indication Laura had been in the area near the facility. Investigators noted that finding no traces in this zone reinforced the likelihood that Laura never came close to the facility that morning, or if she had, any related signs had been obliterated by the harsh weather. After completing the initial search around Lakeview Pet Boarding without finding any specific traces, police moved to the next step, gathering statements from people who lived in or were present in the area on the morning Laura vanished. This was a critical part of reconstructing what might have happened before the family reported her missing, especially since all physical evidence was obscured by snow. Officers went door to door along the road leading to the facility, starting with the closest homes. Several residents said that morning had been quieter than usual, which wasn't surprising in winter, but when pressed, they recalled hearing no unusual vehicles speeding past or stopping near the kennel. One neighbor a few houses down said they saw Laura's car drive by early that morning, but weren't sure whether she actually reached the facility or turned off onto the side road that led to the trail. Another resident who regularly walked their dog in the area noted that traffic was light that morning, and the kennel area seemed unusually quiet. They normally heard dogs barking every morning, but that day there was no sound at all from the facility. A witness, living directly across from the narrow road that connects to the residential area, remembered a pickup truck passing by around the same time. Laura would have left home, but they couldn't make out the license plate or driver because visibility was limited by fog and blowing snow. Police also took a statement from a delivery driver who routinely passed through the area in the mornings. He said he saw no activity at Lakeview Pet Boarding that day and didn't notice Laura or anyone else entering or leaving the building while he drove past. Another piece of information came from the manager of a small farm near the wooded road. He reported hearing an engine revving longer than normal from the direction of the tree-lined road, but couldn't identify the vehicle. None of these accounts carried enough weight to draw a firm conclusion, but officers documented every detail because, in winter missing persons cases, witness statements are sometimes the only thing left when weather wipes out physical evidence. After finishing the first round of interviews, police began piecing together the scattered information into an initial framework. They noted that most witnesses mentioned an unusual silence around the facility that morning, which could suggest Laura never actually arrived there. Some statements referenced an unidentified pickup truck, while others confirmed no activity near the kennel at all. Although no single account was strong enough to serve as a direct lead, combining them helped investigators sketch an overall picture. No one saw Laura at the facility, no one confirmed she entered the woods behind it, and no one observed a clear stranger or suspicious vehicle. After gathering this initial information from the area around Laura's workplace, police returned to the family to dig deeper into her daily routines and personal life, looking for anything out of the ordinary that might explain her sudden disappearance. The family painted a picture of a fairly stable routine. Laura always woke up early to get ready for work, left home at the same time every morning, drove straight to Lakeview Pet Boarding, and rarely deviated from her route. Her job didn't require meeting many people outside her regular clients, and she typically finished in the late afternoon, then either went home or stopped at familiar places like the grocery store near her neighborhood. The family emphasized that Laura was extremely consistent and always let someone know, even about minor changes like running a few minutes late. When asked about the weeks leading up to her disappearance, the family mentioned a few things that had worried them in hindsight, though not enough to raise alarms at the time. A cousin, said Laura, had recently seemed more cautious when leaving the house, sometimes glancing around the front yard before getting in her car or locking the door faster than usual. Another relative recalled Laura mentioning a vague feeling of being watched, though she couldn't pinpoint why or point to any specific incident. The family also said Laura tended to avoid talking about her personal life, especially when the subject of Grant Halverson, her recent ex-husband, came up. When pressed about that relationship, they confirmed the marriage had ended badly after a period of intense conflict. Laura had limited contact with Grant after the divorce, and though she didn't say much, she had admitted that his calls or unexpected appearances made her uncomfortable. A few family members also noticed that in recent weeks, Laura sometimes seemed distracted during conversations, got anxious when her phone rang, and appeared to steer clear of certain topics related to people who might still have influence over her life. Still, they insisted Laura wasn't the type to walk away from her life. She loved her job, was responsible with her clients, and was deeply attached to her family and close friends. That's why they didn't believe she would voluntarily disappear or cut contact without reason. When asked specifically about changes in her personal relationships, the family said that aside from the lingering tension with Grant, Laura had no significant conflicts with anyone else. She kept a low social profile, didn't participate much in community events, but maintained a small, stable circle of friends. None of her close friends reported anything unusual in the days leading up to her disappearance. Police also asked whether Laura had recently mentioned needing help from anyone, expressed concern about someone, or seemed worried about a particular person, but the family could only name Grant. All of this was carefully documented for comparison with evidence from the search area and witness statements. From the family's account, investigators highlighted several key points. Laura followed a predictable daily schedule, had become more cautious in recent weeks, and the complicated relationship with Grant remained a factor that needed thorough follow-up. However, while the information suggested Laura may have been dealing with personal stress, the family had no concrete evidence that she was directly threatened or planning to leave her life behind. Based on the family's description of Laura's usual routes, police mapped out the possible paths she could have taken from home to Lakeview Pet Boarding on the morning she vanished. Though the distance wasn't great, the suburban Duluth area has numerous small side roads that pass through sparsely populated neighborhoods, wooded stretches, and quiet back roads. After reviewing maps, investigators identified three main possible routes. The first was the direct, most commonly used route Laura took to save time. It followed a short road with fairly good visibility until the final turn straight to the facility. The second was longer but sometimes preferred by locals when the main road was blocked by snow. It passed through a small cluster of homes and cut across a wooded trail before joining the road near Lakeview Pet Boarding. The third was a less common loop that Laura might have taken if the main road was busy or weather was bad. Police decided they had to thoroughly check all three routes to rule out the possibility that Laura had an accident or incident before reaching the kennel. On the first route, investigators noted thin ice and complete snow cover that made tracing anything nearly impossible. Houses along the road were far apart, most residents were still inside that early, and no one saw much. Police checked open areas, small clearings, and intersections for dropped items or signs a vehicle had stopped, but found no unusual activity. The second route, which cut through a section of light woods, drew extra attention. They carefully examined the boundary between the pavement and the tree line for any indication someone had pulled over or walked into the woods. A few spots showed compressed snow, but investigators couldn't tell whether it was from a vehicle, a person, or just snow sliding off branches. Residents in the nearby cluster of homes reported nothing noteworthy that morning. Some heard an engine but couldn't identify the vehicle, since traffic, though light, was regular in the area. The third route was checked later in the day because it was farther out. Though Laura rarely used it, police swept it anyway. This route passed a small convenience store and a gas station, places locals sometimes stopped. Officers visited both locations to ask if anyone had seen Laura that morning. Store employees said no one matching her description came in, and transaction records showed nothing from that time frame. At the gas station, the morning shift worker didn't recall a woman stopping alone for fuel or snacks, and the basic outdoor security camera was useless. The fog had blurred everything. After examining all three routes, police concluded there was no clear evidence Laura had encountered trouble anywhere along the main paths. No skid marks, no signs of vehicle damage, no discarded belongings, and no witnesses who saw Laura or a suspicious vehicle at the relevant time. This forced investigators to reassess the entire possible range of her movements and consider that if something happened en route, it left no visible trace under the heavy snow and high winds of a Minnesota winter. While police continued trying to pinpoint the last place Laura might have passed through, search teams expanded their sweep to trails that ran parallel to the three main roads. Old Thompson Trail, a narrow path through light woods not far from Lakeview Pet Boarding, was considered a priority because it offered a possible shortcut between the second route and the wooded area behind the facility. As the team moved along the trail, fresh snow had covered nearly everything. But at the spot where the trail met a slight dip beside it, one searcher spotted a dark object standing out against the white. Approaching, they saw it was a heavy winter glove lying off to the side near some bushes, half buried in soft snow. The shape and color matched the description the family had given of the gloves Laura usually wore, instantly making it the focus of attention. Police immediately documented the exact location, an intersection between the trail and the edge of light woods, where wind could shift snow, but was unlikely to move a heavier object like a glove very far. They marked coordinates on a paper topo map and measured distances to both the second route and Lakeview Pet Boarding. Notes stated the glove was not on the main path, but pushed off to the side toward a small overgrown spur, as if it had dropped while the wearer was moving quickly or had been pulled in another direction. Snow on top of the glove had accumulated enough to show it hadn't fallen after the most recent snowfall, though the exact length of time it had been there couldn't be determined. The team widened the search radius around the find, but located no other items. No clear footprints remained. The new snow had covered everything, and there was no indication anyone had lingered. Still, the lone glove in the open area was significant. It was the first physical item potentially connected to Laura since she left home. Police examined the surrounding terrain carefully, scattered trees leading deeper into the woods on one side, slightly lower ground on the other, with patches where snow appeared lightly pushed by wind. They noted the spot could be reached from either the second route or the trail that led behind Lakeview Pet Boarding, meaning Laura might have passed through or been taken through under circumstances still unknown. The glove was collected following standard procedure, placed in an evidence bag, and sealed for analysis. But at the moment of discovery, its greatest value was giving investigators a concrete spatial marker, the first point in the entire search that offered tangible evidence of Laura's possible presence, not just testimony or deduction, but a real object lying in the uncertain expanse of snowy woods. The discovery of the glove at Old Thompson Trail prompted police to re-examine personal relationships that might be connected to Laura's disappearance. And the first person they needed to interview was Grant Halverson, her ex-husband. Although their marriage had ended before Laura went missing, family members and several close friends had mentioned ongoing tension between the two, making Grant someone who needed to be cleared as soon as possible. When brought in for questioning, Grant stated that on the morning Laura disappeared, he left the house later than usual, ran a few errands, and returned home the same day without encountering anyone noteworthy. However, when police asked for a more detailed account of his route, timeline, and the specific places he visited, inconsistencies in Grant's statement quickly emerged. Grant claimed he stopped at a convenience store to buy a few items, but when police followed up with the store, employees had no recollection of seeing Grant or any transaction that matched the time he mentioned. When asked about the period between leaving home and returning, Grant gave vague, inconsistent timelines that changed with each retelling. He said he had simply driven around to relax, but could not specify a route or particular area. Police pressed him further about where he was during the window that overlapped with the time Laura left her house, but he provided no evidence to support his account. When asked to recount the entire morning in chronological order, Grant continued to alter small details, such as the time he woke up, the reason he left the house, and how long he was out. Although these contradictions were not strong enough to constitute incriminating evidence, they raised serious questions about the truthfulness of his statement. Beyond the timeline issues, police also questioned Grant about his current relationship with Laura. He claimed they no longer kept in touch and that there was no reason for them to meet that day. However, Laura's family had previously mentioned that she complained about Grant contacting her unexpectedly or showing up near her home in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. When confronted directly about these incidents, Grant flatly denied them, insisting that Laura's family had misunderstood or exaggerated the situation. His blanket rejection of the family's accounts without satisfactory explanation was noted by investigators as another red flag. Still, within the scope of this initial interview, there was no concrete evidence placing Grant near Lakeview Pet Boarding on the morning Laura vanished, nor were there any witnesses who saw them together under any circumstances. Investigators tried to probe further, asking whether Grant was aware of any recent changes in Laura's behavior, but he replied that he no longer cared about her life and knew nothing beyond the fact that they were divorced. The response was technically accurate, but his overly curt tone and clear desire to distance himself from any connection to Laura led the interviewers to privately assess his level of cooperation as low. After completing the first interview, police internally classified Grant Haverson as a person of interest requiring continued monitoring. Not enough evidence to designate him an official suspect, but sufficient inconsistencies and concerns to warrant further verification of his statement, cross-checking of timelines, and close attention to any new information that might link him to the case. They recognized that the minor discrepancies in Grant's account, combined with details provided by the family, needed to be handled cautiously, neither jumping to conclusions nor ignoring them. The fact that Grant could not provide a clear itinerary for that morning meant police could not fully rule out the possibility that he was in the area around the time Laura disappeared. At this stage, however, everything remained vague. There was no physical evidence or direct witness testimony tying Grant to the location of the incident. Accordingly, the case file noted that Grant required ongoing verification in subsequent investigative steps, but investigators did not yet have sufficient grounds to take further action beyond monitoring and cross-referencing additional information related to his activities on the day Laura vanished. The discovery of the glove at Old Thompson Trail, combined with the inconsistencies in Grant's statement, led police to expand the search into the Superior Forest, a large area with complex terrain and an intricate network of major and minor trails. The forest features varying tree density, open clearings interspersed with thick stands of pine, steep slopes, and many faint paths that become nearly impossible to discern under snow, creating an environment that easily conceals traces and greatly complicates search efforts. Police coordinated with St. Louis County search teams to form grid-based sweep units, starting from Old Thompson Trail and fanning out in all directions. They prioritized trails commonly used by locals first, including paths that run through pine stands and those that open into clearings. As teams moved deeper into the forest, they observed that heavy snow had obliterated any potential tracks from the time Laura disappeared, making it virtually impossible to identify direction of travel from footprints or drag marks. Nevertheless, searchers flagged certain areas for closer attention, such as unusually depressed patches of ground or sections where vegetation appeared displaced, though they could not determine whether the disturbances were caused by humans or wildlife. The terrain of the Superior Forest forced investigators to seriously consider the hypothesis that Laura may have left her vehicle, voluntarily or under duress, and entered the woods before something unexpected occurred. This theory was supported not only by the glove being found off the main trail, but also by the geography. Numerous sections of forest connect directly to minor roads where a person could exit a vehicle without being seen. To test the possibility that Laura walked into the woods, teams swept the most accessible areas from the three primary access routes, analyzing the location of Old Thompson Trail, distances to secondary paths, and zones reachable by vehicle. During the search, they looked for small personal items, buttons, scraps of fabric, or anything indicating Laura had ventured deeper into the forest. Continuous snowfall and thick ice beneath the surface, however, yielded no clear results. On some wider trails, searchers noted lightly disturbed snow, but without distinct boot prints, they could not confirm whether the marks were made by humans or animals. These observations were marked on maps for potential future correlation if new evidence emerged. Teams also focused on low-lying terrain, where snow accumulates heavily or where someone might slip and fall, but still found no suspicious traces. They examined large tree bases, deep ravines, and areas near clearings, as these locations are less affected by wind and more likely to retain dropped items. After many hours of continuous searching, police concluded that if Laura had entered the forest, she left no obvious signs on the snow surface, or any traces had since been erased by weather conditions. Another factor investigators had to consider was the possibility that Laura was taken into the forest rather than entering on her own. The Superior Forest has numerous narrow roads that remain passable in winter for drivers familiar with the area. This raised the prospect that if a third party was involved, they could have driven onto a seldom-used trail and moved Laura in a way that would be difficult for outsiders to detect. The absence of clear tire tracks did not rule this out, as a moderate snowfall can obliterate tire marks in a short time. In their interim report, the search team concluded that the Superior Forest must be treated as an area with direct potential relevance to Laura's disappearance. Based on 3 factors: its proximity to routes she may have traveled, the location where the glove was found, and terrain that facilitates concealment of both human and vehicular movement. Although no specific discoveries were made, expanding the search into the Superior Forest was a necessary step to determine whether this area formed part of Laura's final journey and to continue gathering data for reconstructing what may have happened on the morning she vanished. After expanding the search into the Superior Forest without finding direct traces of Laura's presence, police shifted focus to verifying the activity of vehicles that had been in the vicinity during the window of her disappearance. This was a critical step to explore whether Laura experienced a traffic-related incident or was stopped by another vehicle while en route. Using witness statements combined with patrol unit observations, police compiled an initial list of approximately 24 trucks, pickups, and SUVs that regularly traveled the area or were seen near routes Laura likely took. The list included vehicles owned by nearby residents, forestry workers, and several unfamiliar vehicles reported on the morning of the disappearance. Investigators began meeting each owner in person to cross-check their location and schedule during the relevant time frame. Many owners quickly provided solid alibis, work receipts, co-worker confirmations, family verification, or schedules that matched independent records and were promptly removed from the list. Numerous local residents used their trucks or SUVs for daily commutes and could demonstrate they passed through the area at specific times without any connection to Laura. Verifying some vehicles required more time, particularly those belonging to residents with similar pickup trucks or SUVs, to ensure nothing was overlooked. One owner of a large box truck employed by a nearby business stated he was at a job site all morning, confirmed by time clock records. Another individual with a gray SUV that regularly traveled the second route provided detailed daily itineraries and was corroborated by nearby store employees who saw his vehicle at the times he described. Such clear alibis helped investigators steadily narrow the list. Not all owners were so easily cleared, however. A few vehicles could not be immediately eliminated due to lack of alibis, and some owners gave vague or inconsistent statements. Particular attention was paid to a distinctive red pickup truck because a witness recalled seeing a similar vehicle near Old Thompson Trail around dawn. When contacted, the owner had no fixed schedule and appeared flustered when explaining his whereabouts, saying only that he was driving around the area without specifying a route. Police flagged this statement for follow-up. Another case involved a dark-colored SUV seen near the third route on that cold morning. The owner claimed he went out to check road conditions, but offered no supporting evidence. When pressed for details about purpose and timing, his account lacked specifics and shifted between interviews. These vehicles remained on the watch list for further correlation with other evidence. Compounding the difficulty was the weather that morning. Heavy fog and falling snow severely limited visibility, causing witnesses to recall only general colors or vehicle types, preventing definitive matches. In the greater Duluth suburban rural area, ownership of pickup trucks and SUVs is extremely common, further complicating differentiation between familiar local vehicles and strangers. Police also reviewed registration records for vehicles frequently operating in the Superior Forest, but not registered to local residents. Several belonged to individuals in logging or small freight haulage. Most had fixed schedules and could clearly account for their whereabouts the morning Laura vanished. Ultimately, after extensive efforts, investigators eliminated the majority of vehicles from the original list, retaining only a small group: several red or brown pickups, a dark SUV, and a small box truck with unclear itineraries, whose owners could not fully verify their location or activities during the critical time frame. Although no direct evidence linked any of these remaining vehicles to Laura, the lack of transparency in their owners' statements and absence of solid alibis kept them under scrutiny for subsequent investigative steps. At the conclusion of the vehicle verification phase, police determined that clarifying the movements of these remaining vehicles could prove pivotal in establishing whether Laura encountered trouble on the road or was approached by another vehicle during the period when no one saw her traveling. To reach firmer conclusions, however, they needed to cross-reference this short list with additional evidence gathered from search areas and witness statements in order to further narrow the possibilities surrounding Laura's movements that morning. After narrowing down the list of vehicles to monitor, but still failing to identify direct clues about Laura's travel route, police refocused on examining her residence to search for additional information that might explain her sudden disappearance. Laura's small house was located in a quiet suburban area and was described as neat, tidy, and perfectly reflecting her careful personality. Upon entering for the inspection, police observed each room to note any signs that Laura had prepared for a normal workday as usual. In the kitchen, the drinking glass and breakfast items remained in their familiar places, with no evidence of rushed or unusual behavior. The living room was still tidy, with documents and magazines stacked neatly and no signs of disturbance. In the bedroom, clothing was arranged according to the habits described by her family, and there was no evidence that Laura had packed luggage or prepared belongings for a long-term departure. Details such as a fully stocked closet, personal items still in their usual places, and no indication of missing belongings suggested that Laura had no intention of leaving the house voluntarily. When checking her personal desk, police found several work-related notes from Lakeview Pet Boarding, including appointment lists, items needed for restocking, and vaccination schedule records for several pets that week. This information indicated that Laura was maintaining normal operations at the facility and had no plans for sudden changes. Police then examined the mailbox near the door, which contained several unopened letters. These were mostly routine bills, community newsletters, and common flyers, with no personal letters or anything unusual. This showed that Laura had no notable correspondence outside her daily activities. Expanding the search to the garage, police noted that the only vehicle Laura regularly used had been absent from the house since the morning of her disappearance, which matched the family's information. Inside the garage, there were no signs that anyone had moved items, nor were there any unfamiliar objects. The tool cabinet was organized, and items appeared undisturbed. Police also checked storage boxes and winter gear to determine whether Laura might have prepared for a trip unknown to her family, but everything indicated no such preparations had been made. In the laundry room, clothes were properly sorted, with some half-done laundry still in baskets awaiting processing, consistent with her normal routine. Police also examined the medicine cabinet for any signs of unusual medication use or anything related to mental health issues, but the amounts used were normal and no new prescriptions had been filled recently. These observations reinforced the conclusion that Laura had no plans to leave the house voluntarily. When reviewing Laura's personal calendar, police discovered that her desk calendar clearly listed work appointments for the week, with no notes about a long trip or any unusual lifestyle changes. This further indicated that Laura expected to be at the pet boarding facility on the day she disappeared. A small notebook near her vanity also contained work notes for the week, including lists of pets to care for and those to be returned to owners in the coming days. These notes were still in progress, proving that Laura had no intention of stopping work or disrupting her schedule. In the nightstand drawer, police found some personal bills and scattered notes related to recent expenses, all reasonable and reflecting Laura's stable life. There were no unusual expenditures or signs that Laura was preparing for a major change in residence or finances. Additionally, the bank accounts police were able to check at the time showed no unusual transactions in the days before her disappearance. When questioning the family further about Laura's mental state, all confirmed that although she sometimes had mild work-related worries or concerns about Grant's suspicious presence at certain times, Laura maintained a stable routine and showed no signs of wanting to cut contact or leave suddenly. This information allowed police to almost completely rule out the possibility that Laura left voluntarily without informing family or colleagues. At the conclusion of the house search, investigators recorded that Laura's living space contained no evidence supporting the theory of voluntary disappearance. All collected data indicated she had prepared for a normal workday that morning. This led police to become even more convinced that Laura's disappearance was against her will and might involve an incident or external factor that subsequent investigative steps would need to clarify. After the search of Laura's home yielded no signs of voluntary departure and uncovered no information suggesting plans to leave Duluth, police shifted the investigation toward individuals who might be directly connected to her disappearance, with Grant Halverson considered a key figure, requiring thorough verification due to inconsistencies in his statements and his history of conflict with Laura. Based on the gathered evidence, police obtained a court warrant to search Grant's residence for potential physical evidence related to the case. Grant's house was located not far from the routes Laura typically took to work, making the search of his property necessary. Upon arrival, police systematically documented each area. In the garage, they quickly noticed several items that were not typical for someone living a simple lifestyle, but were consistent with a person accustomed to venturing into the woods. On a wooden shelf near the garage door, they found an old Superior National Forest map with numerous pencil markings highlighting trails and remote areas. Some markings appeared fresher than others that had faded, suggesting the map had been used at different times. The map was immediately sealed for analysis. Next to the map, police discovered a coil of thick, long rope, typically used for camping or outdoor work, showing signs of prior use but with no clear context. Nearby was a roll of heavy-duty gray duct tape that had been used multiple times and was not stored neatly. The garage also contained a wilderness toolkit, including a knife, small saw, flashlight, and heavy canvas tool bag. Such items are not uncommon for someone living near the forest, but given that Grant could not provide a clear timeline for the morning of Laura's disappearance, these became items requiring close examination. Police also noted several patches of dried dark mud on the garage floor. Based on color and texture, they suspected it could be similar to mud found in low-lying areas of the Superior National Forest. However, since the garage was not regularly cleaned, the exact timing of the mud stains could not be determined. Samples were collected and sent for laboratory comparison with soil from other locations. Additionally, police found a large pair of hiking boots in the corner of the garage. One boot had hardened mud that was coarser than typical residential area soil. When documenting the boot tread pattern, they noted deep lugs suitable for pine forest terrain. The boots were seized and sent for analysis to determine if they matched any footwear impressions recorded in the search area, although thick snow at the scene had previously hindered accurate footprint collection. Moving to the ground floor storage room, police discovered additional outdoor gear, including a large backpack, metal water bottle, and thick cold-weather hiking clothing. This indicated Grant regularly ventured into the woods in winter or at least owned equipment suitable for doing so. In a small drawer near the back door, they found several loose notes, including one paper with markings that matched pencil lines on the map seized from the garage. The purpose of the notes was unclear, but the repeated symbols led police to retain the paper as additional evidence. When checking Grant's vehicle trunk, police found more items such as tie-down straps, rubber gloves, and cloth rags. These could serve various purposes, but since Grant provided no reasonable explanation for his activities on the morning Laura disappeared, police could not dismiss them. Of critical importance during this process was the accurate and consistent documentation of all evidence. The forest map, rope, duct tape roll, wilderness tools, mud-stained boots, vehicle items, and loose notes were each assigned individual evidence numbers, placed in protective bags, and sealed according to legal procedure to prevent later contamination or errors in analysis. Investigators also prepared detailed reports on the exact locations where evidence was found inside the house and garage for future comparison with information gathered from the Superior National Forest scene and routes Laura may have traveled. Although no item found at Grant's home could directly confirm involvement in Laura's disappearance, the overall collection of items raised significant concerns for police. They were consistent with the hypothesis of someone capable of traveling into the forest, concealing traces, or handling situations outdoors. Furthermore, Grant's inability to provide a consistent explanation of his movements heightened suspicion about his whereabouts during the critical time. At the conclusion of the search, the investigative team tagged all seized evidence for analysis to determine whether any items were directly or indirectly linked to Laura Houghton's disappearance. Although no final conclusions were reached, this search provided police with an important set of physical evidence requiring further processing in subsequent investigative phases. After completing the search of Grant's home and seizing numerous items potentially connected to the Superior National Forest area, police returned to another line of information that could clarify what happened to Laura shortly before she vanished. The calls left on her home answering machine. This was one of the few sources that could directly reflect spoken interactions Laura received in her final days, especially since family members had mentioned she seemed more cautious and occasionally anxious when the phone rang. The answering machine was removed from its place beside the landline, taken to the police station, and processed according to 1990 electronic device protocols. Although technology was limited, investigators were still able to play, rewind, and manually transcribe the entire cassette tape contents. When playing the voicemail messages, police found that most calls were from regular Lakeview pet boarding clients or family members leaving routine daily messages. However, interspersed among the normal calls were a series of recordings with a tense and sometimes threatening tone, clearly differing in content and level of familiarity from the usual calls Laura received. Several messages were left by a caller who did not identify himself, speaking briefly in ways that would make the listener uncomfortable. In one message, a low male voice spoke coldly, implying that Laura shouldn't ignore conversations or don't think you can avoid me forever. Another message showed clearer irritation, telling Laura she needed to talk soon. These messages contained no specific details about time, place, or direct demands, but the tone conveyed pressure mixed with anger and was unlike any voice from regular clients. Police noted that these messages appeared sporadically over the few weeks before Laura's disappearance, which aligned with family accounts that she had seemed worried, looked around the yard before getting into her car, and avoided certain topics in family conversations. Upon reviewing the entire tape, investigators observed that the voice in several calls bore similarities to Grant Haverson's voice. Although equipment at the time could not perform scientific voice analysis, police recorded that the timbre, cadence, and speech patterns closely resembled Grant's. When family members listened to the messages, they also felt the same similarity, though they could not confirm it with absolute certainty. This resemblance was not sufficient for legal evidence, but it placed the relationship between Laura and Grant under even greater suspicion. Police cross-referenced the timing of the calls using the answering machine's activity log and displayed date-time information, although the system was not as precise as modern devices. However, the fact that many of the threatening calls occurred in the evening or early morning, times when Laura was typically home alone, helped police conclude that these calls may have affected her mental state in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. They continued analyzing the content to see if any statements referenced meetings, specific conflicts, or direct mentions of her work or travel routes, but most threatening messages remained vague and generalized, lacking concrete details. This suggested the caller deliberately kept the content ambiguous yet oppressive. Police also noted that Laura's failure to delete these messages could indicate two possibilities. Either she considered them unimportant, or she did not want to confront their contents and therefore ignored them. During examination of the device, investigators discovered a small section of the tape showed signs of being recorded over, making one message segment difficult to hear. Although the original content could not be determined, the presence of the overwrite raised questions: had someone else accessed Laura's phone and deliberately recorded over part of the tape? Or was it simply a common technical glitch in older answering machines? All significant messages were extracted, copied, and added to the case file. Police reached the preliminary conclusion that the threatening calls were a factor that could not be ignored in the context of Laura's disappearance. Although it could not yet be confirmed that the caller was Grant, the vocal similarities combined with the history of tension between them made this analysis a crucial part of continuing to evaluate Laura's relationships in the period before she went missing. After analyzing the recordings on Laura's answering machine and identifying the presence of calls that carried a tone of pressure or threat, police expanded their search to structures scattered along the Superior Forest, areas dotted with cabins, old barns, and abandoned farms. These locations were considered potential for concealing traces or being connected to an unexpected situation if Laura or someone else had entered the woods on the morning she disappeared. Most of the cabins and old sheds in the region were privately owned, but rarely used. Some sat right off major trails, while others were set deeper in the woods and reachable only by little-known side roads. Police coordinated a dedicated search team equipped with topographic maps, marking every accessible structure within a close radius of where the glove had been found. The goal was to check every cabin, every shed, and every derelict farmyard for any physical signs, tracks, or dropped items that might connect to Laura or another person moving through the area during the critical time frame. The first cabin was the closest to the old Thompson Trail, an old, weathered wooden structure. Police had to proceed carefully because the ground around it was covered in deep snow. Inside there was little furniture, just a few old wooden crates and some unremarkable items. However, on the back porch, they noticed several faint boot prints in the snow, though the shapes were mostly distorted by wind. Fresh snowfall had already obscured the necessary details, making it impossible to determine whether the prints were made before or after Laura went missing. The second cabin was farther off the main road, in denser woods. The team had to follow a narrow trail to reach it. This cabin showed signs of more recent use than the first. Freshly split firewood had been added to the stack, and the back door was not fully locked. Inside, officers found scraps of paper, food wrappers, and evidence of temporary occupancy. Still, there were no personal items that could be linked to Laura, and no signs of a struggle, disturbance, or anything she might have carried. On the path leading to the cabin, more boot prints were visible, but they suffered the same problem. The snow surface was deformed, preventing any pattern comparison with the shoes seized from Grant's house or any samples from the search area. The third cabin was sturdier, part of a once operating farm that had been abandoned for years. The surrounding area was mostly open land at the forest's edge, where snow tended to pile deep. Officers searched every room and tool shed, but found only old, unused items. There were no signs of recent entry, and a thin layer of dust on the front door indicated it had not been opened in a long time. In this area, they spent extra time examining the yard, where 3 small paths led into the woods. On one of those paths, they noticed unusual snow compression, but there was no distinct shape to identify it as footprints or tire tracks. The fourth cabin was in a harder-to-reach spot, near a wooded slope. Officers wore protective gear to avoid slipping on thin ice. When they arrived, the cabin was essentially derelict, broken windows, rotting walls. Yet on the covered back porch, they found a small piece of fabric stuck to ice and snow, its color unclear due to prolonged dampness. The scrap was deemed too degraded for immediate identification, but it was collected for later analysis. Below the cabin, near the base of the slope, they observed a few patches of lightly compressed earth, but the terrain and harsh weather prevented determining what caused the marks. The fifth cabin was closer to the area where some witnesses had reported seeing a pickup truck pass by. This one was still occasionally used by its elderly owner and therefore contained more items inside. Police were granted permission to search and noted several boot prints near the back door. These appeared fresher than those at the previous cabins, yet still too snow-covered to reveal any pattern or size. They also found half-used food boxes and tin cans. None of the items showed any connection to Laura, and the owner confirmed he had stayed there a few days before her disappearance. The search continued into old barns once belonging to farms or households no longer occupied in the area. These barns typically held only rusted tools or broken equipment. While examining corners, officers noticed lightly disturbed dirt floors in a few, but no personal items had been left behind. One larger barn at the forest's edge contained numerous animal tracks, making it hard to distinguish human prints. Although a few relatively clear boot prints showed size, tread details were lost due to the icy surface and low temperatures that hardened the snow over time. None of the recorded prints met the standard needed for accurate comparison with the shoes seized at Grant's house. The sweep of cabins and barns yielded no items clearly indicating Laura's presence, but police noted that unidentified boot prints at some cabins near where the glove was found kept the forest as a viable investigative direction. Though the results were not breakthrough, they allowed investigators to rule out several suspicious locations while forming a broader picture of activity in the forest. Around the time Laura vanished, most cabins showed no use, but a few locations had evidence of human presence within an indeterminate time frame. During the cabin and barn searches along the Superior Forest, police received new information from a resident living near the secondary road on the morning Laura disappeared. This person saw a strange man walking near the forest edge, carrying a large backpack and wearing a dark coat. The sighting stood out because the forest area saw almost no foot traffic in early winter mornings, and someone walking alone in harsh weather was unusual. The report immediately raised the possibility that the man was connected to Laura's disappearance, especially since no physical evidence had been found at the scene and no witness had yet seen Laura after she left home. With the information still vague, police began trying to locate the man, starting with the witness's basic description: average build, thick dark coat, hood or hat covering most of the head, larger than normal backpack, and a hurried gait. Though the details were not specific enough for identification, the lead still had to be followed. They visited convenience stores, gas stations, and public places along the road near the forest to ask if anyone had seen a man matching the description. At a small store near the intersection of the secondary road and the forest trail, a clerk recalled seeing a man that morning who bought coffee and a few small items. The clerk described him as looking tired, alone, and not talkative. The timing matched the morning of Laura's disappearance, prompting police to intensify efforts to trace where the man went after leaving the store. They followed the trail by checking nearby gas stations. One station a short distance away confirmed the man had stopped for a small amount of fuel before continuing north, the opposite direction from where the glove was found, and farther from the routes Laura normally took. The attendant confirmed he was driving an older SUV, meaning the man had not been hiking through the forest, but only walked a short distance near the cabins, possibly to rest or sightsee. Police then checked a small motel on the main road where winter travelers or hikers often stayed. The owner confirmed that a man with a large backpack matching the description had rented a room 2 days before Laura vanished and checked out early on the morning of the incident. According to the register, he was from out of state and said he was traveling through Minnesota to photograph winter scenery. Notably, the man had signed his real name, left a phone number, and provided valid ID. The owner added that the guest left in a hurry because of bad weather and wanted to head north earlier than planned. These details began painting a different picture. The man near the forest was simply traveling on a personal trip, with no indication he approached the Lakeview pet boarding area or Laura's usual routes. Still, police had to verify further to rule out any connection. They called the provided phone number for a direct interview. During the call, the man confirmed he was in the area that morning, exactly as described by witnesses and the motel register. He explained he had walked along the forest briefly to take early morning photos while it was still foggy, then returned to his vehicle and continued his trip. He provided details of his stops, including the store and gas station, which matched the employees' statements. When asked if he had seen any woman near the forest or on the road toward the cabins, he firmly stated he saw no one during that time. He described the area as deserted and so cold that he only walked a short distance before returning to his car and driving away. When police cross-checked the timeline using receipts and time logs from the stops, everything aligned with the man's account. Even the gas station receipt showed he left the broader area before Laura was confirmed missing. For added certainty, officers inspected the man's SUV and noted no signs it had been driven on narrow forest trails, no branches, brush, or mud consistent with the old Thompson Trail area under the vehicle. Additionally, the man had a clear residence, a transparent itinerary, and no connection whatsoever to Laura or local residents. With all data from the store, gas station, motel, and the man's own statement matching perfectly, police concluded he had no involvement in Laura's disappearance. He had simply been in the area at the same time by coincidence, triggering necessary scrutiny, but every piece of evidence showed he was just a passing traveler. After eliminating the man seen near the forest from viable leads, police refocused on the factor that had repeatedly surfaced throughout the investigation: the tense, unstable, and abusive relationship between Laura and Grant Haverson. Combining early family statements with evidence from searches and the threatening messages on the answering machine, investigators compiled every past report of violence, control, and threats recorded between the couple. Although Laura and Grant's marriage had ended, the lingering tension and Grant's unstable behavior appeared as an escalating pattern in the period leading up to Laura's disappearance. Reviewing law enforcement reports from the final 2 years of the marriage revealed several documented incidents, though most did not rise to serious criminal charges. One report noted Laura had called police after a major argument in which Grant exhibited extreme controlling behavior and anger when she tried to leave the house. Another recorded neighbors hearing loud arguing, but by the time officers arrived, the situation had calmed and no further assistance was requested. While no incident resulted in clear physical injury, the documents revealed a repeated pattern of control and emotional pressure from Grant. Several of Laura's close friends had also mentioned Grant showing up unexpectedly at her workplace or around her home, making her feel unsafe, even though his actions were not deemed illegal. In private conversations, Laura had expressed exhaustion at Grant's constant attempts to interfere in her life despite the divorce and her desire for clear distance. When these reports were compared to the common escalation pattern seen in missing persons cases involving domestic abuse, investigators noted striking similarities. The pattern describes a relationship progressing from emotional control, pressure, and stalking to more dangerous behavior when the controlling party feels loss of power, especially after divorce or when the victim tries to separate. In Laura's case, many elements fit: Grant's increasing instability, unwanted appearances at places she frequented, threatening calls, and signs that Laura had grown more anxious and cautious recently. Analysis of the answering machine recordings also revealed a tone in the threatening calls consistent with someone experiencing rising stress and loss of emotional control. Combined with Grant's lack of transparency about his movements on the morning Laura vanished, investigators had stronger grounds to view him as significantly involved. However, suspicion and proof are entirely different in an investigation. While past events provided context showing Grant as a potential threat to Laura, police still lacked any direct forensic evidence placing him near the Superior Forest or Laura's route at the critical time. Items seized from his home, forest maps, rope, duct tape, hiking gear, were suspicious but could easily belong to someone living near the woods who regularly hiked. The muddy boots in Grant's garage were also insufficient, as prints at the check cabins and barns lacked clear enough tread for comparison. Police considered using the timing and content of the threatening messages to bolster suspicion, but under legal standards at the time, the messages were not strong enough to constitute evidence, especially without technical voice confirmation. In 1990, voice analysis technology for criminal investigations was not advanced enough to produce accurate or court-admissible results. Moreover, Laura's disappearance left no physical traces, no dropped items, drag marks, or clear signs of violence near her home or usual route, making it difficult to establish a specific crime. Investigators had to separate possibility from evidence. Grant may have been the last person in serious conflict with Laura, may have contacted her in ways that frightened her, and may have been in the forest based on items he owned. but there was no legal means to prove he was present during the critical window. Analysis of past behavioral patterns therefore only helped police assess risk, increase surveillance, and keep Grant as the central figure for ongoing verification. But it could not support a conclusion. Though investigators clearly sensed a fit between the escalating behavior and Laura's disappearance, all these data points remained in the supporting information category, insufficient to elevate the investigation further. This left the team in a frustrating bind, recognizing the danger but unable to act more forcefully due to lack of legal grounds, while still having no concrete clue as to Laura's whereabouts or what exactly happened after she left home on that winter morning. After compiling the entire context related to Grant Halverson and completing the analysis of his past pattern of violent behavior, the investigative team moved on to processing the seized physical evidence in an effort to determine whether any physical proof could directly link to Laura Houghton's disappearance. However, the year 1990 imposed severe limitations on forensic capabilities. DNA technology was in its infancy. Fiber analysis, biological trace evidence, and chemical contact traces were extremely limited, and most conclusions relied on visual observation, sample comparison, or basic physical structural analysis. Although the investigators knew these items of evidence could play a crucial role in reconstructing the events of the disappearance, they also understood that expectations for breakthrough results had to be tempered by the technological realities of the era. The first item submitted for analysis was the glove found on the Old Thompson Trail. Establishing ownership of the glove was a critical task, as it was the only item discovered near the area considered directly related to Laura's route. However, the forensic capabilities of the time did not allow for DNA recovery from fabric surfaces. Technicians could only document the fiber type, degree of wear, size, and stitching style. The glove was identified as a common type sold at numerous stores in the Duluth area, with no proprietary details that could trace it back to a specific purchaser. When shown to the family, they confirmed that Laura had owned a similar pair but could not positively state that this particular glove belonged to her, since many locals use the same thick, dark-colored winter gloves. Additionally, the glove's surface no longer retained identifiable skin cells or hair due to snow saturation that had wetted and distorted the fiber structure. Technicians also noted a few faint soil smudges along the cuff, but the soil only reflected the general characteristics of the superior forest region and was insufficient to pinpoint a specific location or the time the glove was dropped. They attempted to compare this soil with mud samples taken from Grant's boots, but the color and texture were so similar that no scientific conclusion could be reached. The second item analyzed was the rope seized from Grant's residence. Rope of this type was commonly used for outdoor activities, securing loads or hiking, and in 1990, lifting fingerprints from rope was extremely difficult because the coarse fiber surface did not retain clear prints. Technicians examined the rope's tensile strength, wear patterns, and fiber properties, and compared them with evidence from the scene, but found no unusual indicators, no severed strands, signs of extreme tension, or distinctive soil adhesion. The rope in Grant's garage showed signs of prior use, but nothing suggested it had been involved in a struggle or heavy transport. Surface analysis also revealed no foreign fabric fibers, hair, or other organic material, due both to the lack of advanced technology and to the item having been used repeatedly and contaminated with ordinary household debris. The third item was the roll of gray duct tape. Duct tape can be valuable in forensic analysis if fingerprints are present, but in 1990, the chances of recovering clear fingerprints from tape that had already been unrolled and used were very low. Technicians attempted to analyze residual adhesive on the layers, but determining whether the roll had ever been used for an unusual purpose remained beyond the analytical capabilities of the time. They also checked for soil, animal hair, or fabric fibers similar to those at the scene, but results were inconclusive. The duct tape was ultimately classified as an ordinary household item, though in the context of the investigation, it continued to be retained for future comparison should additional physical evidence emerge. The Superior National Forest map seized from Grant's home was also submitted for analysis. Technicians and investigators examined the markings on the map, pencil lines, arrow symbols, circled areas, looking for connections to routes Laura might have taken. Some markings coincided with trails the search teams had already checked, but that proved nothing because the maps were widely sold and locals commonly annotated their personal copies for navigation. The fresh pencil marks clearly indicated recent use. Yet that still could not be directly tied to the disappearance. There were no distinctive fingerprints or standout identifying features beyond the usual creases and edge wear from handling. Finally, police examined the minor items collected from cabins and sheds, small fabric scraps, food wrappers, paper debris, or soil dragged in streaks. All were either too common or lacked any distinctive characteristics linking them to Laura. Comparisons of soil, fibers, or dirt with items from Grant's home or the glove yielded the same result. No definitive analytical value given the limited forensic capabilities. The entire process underscored a hard reality. The investigation was up against a technological barrier. Although police had seized numerous potentially significant items, the technology available in 1990 did not allow them to exploit those items in a way that could produce a major breakthrough in the case. This led the team to realize they might be dealing with a disappearance in which physical evidence would never speak clearly or had already been erased by the environment before they could reach it. The items became documentation in the file rather than investigative leads. Despite the absence of breakthroughs, this analytical phase still played an important role in ruling out direct physical links between Grant and the location where Laura may have vanished, while clarifying the limits of what could be proven forensically in 1990. With the physical evidence analysis yielding no breakthroughs and 1990-era forensics unable to either support or refute any hypothesis regarding Grant Halverson, police shifted focus to the area most likely to provide clearer leads: Grant's financial movements and transactions on the day Laura disappeared. Verifying spending activity became essential because in many similar missing person cases, purchases, cash withdrawals, fuel stops, or visits to stores can leave time-stamped traces, indirect but useful evidence for cross-referencing statements and identifying unexplained gaps that a suspect cannot account for. Police began by requesting bank records for Grant's transactions in the 2 days before and after the incident. In 1990, bank card transactions were far less common than in later decades, but Grant had an account and occasionally used his card for cash withdrawals. The transaction log showed he had withdrawn a small amount of cash the day before Laura vanished, but there were no transactions at all on the morning she disappeared. That was not unusual in itself, yet it provided no specific information. What stood out, however, was that Grant used his card 0 times on the entire day of the incident, a fact that might have been innocuous had there been no other reasons for suspicion. Police then examined receipts recovered during the search of Grant's home. A few scattered receipts in his truck and garage documented fuel purchases, outdoor supplies, and fast food in the preceding weeks, but none corresponded to the morning Laura went missing. When canvassing local businesses Grant was known to frequent, officers asked employees if they remembered seeing him that day. One convenience store near the secondary route reported that Grant usually stopped by early in the morning, but the morning shift clerk on the day Laura disappeared did not recall seeing him. There were no security cameras in stores at that time, so verification relied solely on memory. Next, police visited the gas station, where Grant regularly filled up. A review of the handwritten transaction log showed no entries matching Grant's license plate or vehicle description for that morning. That did not rule out his presence in the area. If his tank was sufficiently full, he would have had no need to stop for fuel. Still, it reinforced the fact that there was no confirmed evidence placing Grant at any public location during the critical time window. For deeper cross-checking, police compiled a list of nearby establishments Grant might have visited if he had taken the forest route or entered the area. This included roadside stores, coffee shops, auto repair shops, and other small businesses within a 10-mile radius. At an auto shop a few miles from Grant's home, the owner confirmed Grant had come in late the previous afternoon to fix a brake light, but they had not seen him that morning. This matched a receipt found in the garage, but offered no direct corroboration. When all the time data and maps were connected, police began to see a significant gap in Grant's alibi, from the moment Laura left home until staff realized she had not arrived at the facility, and the family called police. Grant could not document his whereabouts for the crucial 2-3 hour window. His statement that he had simply driven around to relax was unsupported by any witness, receipt, or transaction record. Meanwhile, the idea of aimless driving struck investigators as hard to accept, especially in the bitter cold and hazardous winter road conditions of a Minnesota morning. People living near the forest rarely ventured out without a clear reason under those circumstances. To probe further, police compared the time Grant claimed to have left home with sightings of a red pickup truck near the forest area. Although no license plate was confirmed, the color and size matched Grant's vehicle. Without surveillance cameras, however, no firm conclusion was possible. Police continued checking handwritten logs from rural toll booths, but most side roads at that time had no recording system or attendant. Verification of Grant's movements thus relied primarily on elimination. He was not recorded at any public location, had no purchase receipts, no fuel records, and no witnesses placing him anywhere other than his own statement. When the unaccounted-for time period was weighed against the discovery time of the glove, police noted the two could overlap. The interval when Laura vanished, the hours Grant could not explain, and the location where the glove was found all fit a logical sequence under the hypothesis of someone leaving home, traveling to the forest area, and returning. Yet everything remained at the level of inference. Although police could construct a timeline showing Grant was capable of reaching the Superior Forest area, they lacked any physical data to prove it. Grant's alibi gap thus became a critical piece of the puzzle, but still fell short of enough evidence to conclude guilt or file charges. At the end of the transaction and movement review phase, police noted in the file that Grant had an unaccounted-for block of time on the morning Laura disappeared, a suspicious gap that kept him at the center of suspicion, but did not provide sufficient evidence to elevate him to official suspect status. Despite scouring routes, searching the Superior Forest, analyzing evidence, and mapping Grant Haverson's movements, the investigation into Laura's disappearance advanced no further in any legally meaningful way. Police never located a body, found signs of violence, or recovered any additional personal items beyond the untraceable glove. No witness directly saw Laura after she left home that winter morning. All accounts were based on supposition, indirect observation, or hazy memory. Footprints around cabins had been obliterated by snow, items seized from Grant's home lacked biological traces, and 1990 forensic analysis could not establish any specific scientific link between evidence and the victim. Even the leads considered most promising, threatening phone calls, Grant's unaccounted-for time, the forest map, and outdoor tools, failed to meet the minimum evidentiary standard required to support charges. There was no DNA, no matching fingerprints, no witness confirming Grant's presence in the search area during the critical window. All the investigative team had was a collection of suspicions, educated guesses, and disconnected fragments that could not be forged into a legally coherent chain. Upon reviewing the entire case file, police found no remaining avenue that could be meaningfully pursued within the technological constraints of the time. Superior National Forest search teams had conducted multiple sweeps over many weeks, but turned up no new traces. Snow continued to fall, flattening the landscape and erasing any potential clues that might have lingered. The routes Laura might have taken yielded nothing more. Icy, snow-covered surfaces retained no tire tracks or footprints, and rural areas had no surveillance cameras to help reconstruct travel. Efforts to verify personal disputes, past violent behavior, and tension between Laura and Grant only reached the level of risk assessment, never direct incrimination. Although records showed Laura had been anxious, guarded, and possibly under mental strain in her final weeks. No physical evidence proved she was threatened on the morning she vanished. As weeks passed without new developments, the investigation gradually ground to a halt. Detectives progressively narrowed their task list, checking off exhausted leads and closing items for lack of further data. Frustration spread throughout the team. They had tested hundreds of soil samples, inspected dozens of cabins, mapped numerous routes, and cross-referenced countless statements, yet remained no closer to an answer. As winter tightened its grip on Minnesota and snow accumulated daily, hope of finding direct traces of Laura grew ever fainter. After weeks of continuous effort, with no fresh information, the Duluth Police Department had to acknowledge they had reached the limit of the initial investigation. Laura Houghton's file was moved to inactive status, not fully closed, but with no active leads left to pursue. The first investigation officially stalled, leaving a heavy void in the record, a family without answers, and a community still unsettled by the fact that a woman had vanished in a Minnesota winter without leaving a single trace. Before officially entering the stagnation phase, the Duluth Police Department conducted one final search at the end of winter 1990, when the snow had begun to melt lightly in some areas, creating more favorable conditions for observing the ground. This was considered the last effort to determine whether Laura might have been buried, covered by thick snow, or taken to low-lying areas in the Superior Forest before the winter snow completely blanketed everything. The search team, in coordination with St. Louis County forces, expanded the search area in a large fan pattern, focusing on locations where the terrain was likely to have been disturbed, soft soil areas, stream banks, sunken strips of land, or places where snow melted earlier than usual due to direct sunlight during longer days. Some areas that had been completely snow-covered during the first week of searching were now beginning to reveal the ground beneath, allowing police to re-examine previously marked suspicious spots that could not be fully investigated due to harsh weather conditions. As the snow partially melted, the ground surface clearly showed cracks, loose patches of soil, or areas with signs of digging, even though these signs could be entirely natural due to temperature changes. The search teams used probing rods, small picks, and shallow digging tools to check every area with unusual soil color. In the Superior Forest, there were sections near small streams where flowing water caused snow to melt earlier. These were areas the police focused on more intensely. However, most soft soil spots revealed completely natural structures, no signs of burial, no foreign objects beneath the surface, and no evidence of human intervention. In sunny slopes where snow melted in patches, police looked for any items that might have been exposed after the ice thawed. But there were no personal belongings, pieces of fabric, shoes, or any signs related to Laura. Some areas with loose soil prompted the search team to expand their checks, but when shallow digging and close inspection of the soil layers were conducted, everything proved to be either long-accumulated snow pockets or areas disturbed by animals. Police also examined lower spots near tree bases where melting snow formed small pools of water, as these were places that often revealed dropped items if any had fallen there. Yet, despite checking dozens of such locations, the search team found nothing belonging to Laura. A wider area near an old trail, initially flagged due to uneven surface markings, was re-swept by the full search team and cadaver dogs. But this time, just like previous ones, there were no signs of a body or related items. The soil beneath was completely undisturbed, with no human-caused disruption that could have occurred during the time she went missing. Even when police dug deeper than the usual survey depth, they found nothing but naturally frozen earth layers. Several suspected burial sites reported by local residents near the forest were also checked. One person reported slight sinking near their fence line. The search team investigated, but discovered the subsidence was caused by a frozen drainage pipe. Another report mentioned a dark patch of soil near an abandoned cabin, but upon inspection, police determined it was simply naturally darker soil due to fallen trees blocking sunlight. After 3 consecutive days of sweeping, police moved to lower areas near a wasteland east of the forest, places some initial search teams thought might conceal objects under ice. However, the melting snow revealed completely normal ground, with no fresh digging marks or unusual soil compression. Toward the end of the search, the investigation team expanded to old rock pits and strips of land next to abandoned logging stations. The situation was the same, naturally frozen soil structure with no foreign traces. When all reports were compiled, the investigation team confirmed that the final 1990 search yielded no valuable results. No body, no new evidence, no traces indicating Laura had ever been in the searched areas. Despite the expanded and more thorough search scope made possible by melting snow, police were still unable to find any factor that could break the case's deadlock. This was the last search of the initial investigation phase, and its outcome further reinforced the reality that Laura Houghton's disappearance had exceeded the reach of traditional search methods available at the time. By early 1991, after many months of searching, sweeping, and analysis without any new leads emerging, the Duluth PD was forced to follow standard procedure for long-term missing persons cases. The Laura Houghton file was transferred to the St. Louis County Cold Case category. The main file, along with all investigation reports, crime scene diagrams, witness statements, and forensic analysis results, underwent a final review to ensure completeness before being moved to a dedicated storage archive. Physical evidence collected during the investigation, the glove found on Old Thompson Trail, the forest map from Grant Halverson's house, the rope, roll of duct tape, mud-covered shoes, and small items recovered from the cabin, was all sealed according to 1991 evidence preservation protocols, placed in specialized boxes with identification codes and detailed descriptions to ensure accuracy if the case needed to be reopened in the future. Although these items yielded no breakthrough during the initial investigation, they were retained because forensic science might advance over time, opening opportunities for reanalysis in later years. A copy of the entire paper file was kept at the Duluth Police Department records room, while the original was transferred to the county-level cold case archive, which housed unsolved cases that remained eligible for reopening upon new leads. During the file transfer process, investigators briefly discussed remaining investigative avenues, but unanimously agreed there was no additional data strong enough to justify continued active investigation. Suspicions surrounding Grant Halverson remained in the file as contextual background, but there was no legal evidence to designate him as a suspect. The fact that Laura left no trace, no body, no direct witnesses, and no forensic evidence meeting standards made the case one of the most difficult the Duluth PD had ever handled. Once procedures were complete, Laura's disappearance was officially noted in the county's cold case tracking log, a case neither closed nor under active investigation, only to be revisited if new information emerged. Laura's family was notified that the file had been moved to cold case status, and although they wished the search would continue, they understood no agency could provide further information given the complete absence of data. From this point onward, the Laura Houghton disappearance fell into prolonged silence, becoming one of northern Minnesota's enduring mysteries, a file lying dormant in storage, waiting many years until technology, circumstances, or a new clue might bring the case back into the light of investigation. From 1992 to 2000, Laura Houghton's missing person file remained on the St. Louis County cold case list, but that did not mean it was completely forgotten. Per county procedure, each year or whenever new personnel joined the investigative unit, certain cold cases were given a preliminary review to assess the potential for new investigative directions. Laura's case became one of the most frequently re-examined files, not because new leads appeared, but due to its unusual nature, a woman vanishing on a short route from home to work without leaving a trace, in an area with no notable criminal activity at the time. When new investigators accessed the file, they noted the standout points: the glove found on Old Thompson Trail, vague footprints at some cabins, suspicious items in Grant Halverson's home, and his unprovable alibi time frame. Although these details were documented, they still did not constitute evidence. Nevertheless, The arrival of younger investigators, who often brought fresh perspectives, caused Laura's case to be reopened for review multiple times between 1992 and 2000. Some investigators suggested resurveying the old cabin areas, especially those near less traveled trails where snow and the environment might have initially concealed evidence. A small team in the mid-1990s checked 2 of those cabins, primarily to assess structural changes over time. However, the cabins had deteriorated and furnishings had been partially removed by local residents or hikers, making it impossible to compare their condition to 1990. No cabin retained footprints or items that could be linked, and the entire area had changed too much to draw conclusions. Some internal reports also mentioned re-examining the forest map seized from Grant's house. One younger investigator suggested the map's markings could be cross-referenced with trail system updates recorded in the mid-1990s. However, when the re-evaluation team compared the old map to current ones, they found Grant's markings still matched popular routes from that era. No markings led to new areas or suggested specific locations beyond those already searched during the initial investigation. Evidence was carefully preserved but could not be analyzed further because DNA technology did not become widespread until the late 1990s, and even when DNA began being used in criminal investigations, the samples on the glove and rope were no longer of sufficient quality due to long-term environmental exposure. Investigators also considered re-interviewing 1990 witnesses to see if anyone living near the Superior Forest at the time recalled additional details. However, memories had faded over the years and most simply repeated what they had already told police during the initial investigation. There were no new statements. No one came forward claiming responsibility or offering different information. During this period, one investigator noticed similarities between Laura's disappearance and another assault that occurred in a Duluth suburb, but upon review, the 2 incidents had no connection. No matching locations, no overlapping individuals, and no evidence suggesting the same perpetrator. The file remained stagnant. Another point repeatedly examined throughout the 1990s was Grant Halverson's behavior after the disappearance. Police noted that he never left Minnesota, exhibited no notable criminal activity, and showed no particular signs of concealment or abnormality. Some investigators felt his overly normal post-incident behavior actually reduced suspicion in the absence of case progress. Others argued that such normalcy could be a cover, but there were no legal tools for deeper investigation. In the late 1990s, a proposal to rescan the forest area using metal detectors and new search equipment was approved for a trial run. However, the effort found nothing related, only rusted metal scraps and remnants of old camping gear from previous forest visitors. When all the scattered 1992-2000 review results were compiled, the file clearly showed a repeated conclusion, no significant difference from the initial investigation phase. Every search effort, sweep, evidence check, or area resurvey led to the same outcome: no progress. The Laura Houghton case continued to sit in the cold case archive, not forgotten, but unable to move forward, becoming a file that for many years was opened only to be reviewed and closed again, awaiting something the investigators at the time did not yet know: technology, time, or a new development that could change what they once believed was an absolute dead end. From 2001 to 2010, the criminal investigation landscape in Minnesota and across the United States changed dramatically as DNA technology advanced rapidly, opening possibilities to resolve hundreds of long-dormant cases. However, that progress did not mean every cold case automatically received new technology, especially in smaller counties like St. Louis, where resources were limited and testing priorities favored cases involving bodies, clear biological traces, or active violent crimes. Laura Houghton's missing person case, which had no body, no evidence containing clear DNA, and no direct signs of a crime, continued to receive little attention despite the significant technological changes since the early 1990s. In the early years of this period, some cold case unit investigators proposed submitting Laura's evidence, particularly the glove and rope, for new generation DNA testing. Those proposals, however, were not approved for two reasons. First, the county's DNA testing budget was primarily allocated to unidentified body cases, backlog sexual assault cases, or murders where victims' families were still actively pursuing justice. Second, the evidence in Laura's case had been stored for over a decade under early-era warehouse conditions, meaning the chances of remaining biological samples being of sufficient quality for DNA analysis were extremely low. Fabric fibers had absorbed moisture, evidence surfaces had extensive environmental exposure, and no blood, hair, or skin cells had been confirmed in 1990. When DNA technology entered the phase of expanded trace analysis, Laura's file was still not prioritized because the technique still required a minimum sample concentration, something the disappearance evidence almost completely lacked. During the same period, other Minnesota counties began solving cold cases using improvements in mitochondrial DNA or YSTR analysis. The solved cases typically had clear biological samples, human bones, soft tissue, blood stains, or items with organic residue. Laura's case, by contrast, completely lacked these elements. In St. Louis County, new technologies were available but used sparingly due to high testing costs, long result turnaround times, and the small number of accredited laboratories. Only a limited number of cases were sent for analysis each year, usually those with clear legal value if testing succeeded. That left bodiless missing person cases like Laura's at the bottom of the priority list. Beyond resource issues, legal factors also caused Laura's disappearance to be overlooked throughout this period. The absence of physical proof that a crime had even occurred made it difficult for law enforcement to convince courts or county administration to approve testing funds. In the file, Laura was classified as a missing adult, suspicious circumstances, a designation not strong enough to establish legal grounds for advanced testing requests. Many later generation investigators who reviewed the file noted suspicious aspects of the relationship between Laura and Grant Haverson, but without biological traces, they could not argue that DNA testing was necessary. One investigator in 2006 suggested trying to analyze DNA in the mud stuck to the shoes seized from Grant's garage, but the proposal was never carried out because the sample had oxidized too severely and no longer held viable organic material. The glove was also re-examined in 2007, but the forensic specialist at the time confirmed no remaining traces sufficient to generate a DNA profile. In the late 2000s, DNA analysis technology continued accelerating, yet that created additional challenges for small counties. Demand for testing rose, waiting lists grew longer, and laboratories prioritized cases with higher solve potential. Laura's case, no body, no biological samples, no formally charged suspect, remained in the does not meet testing criteria category. During this time, Laura's family maintained periodic contact with police, occasionally asking whether new technology could help. The answer was almost always the same: no samples to test, no body, no clear crime scene. The scattered items found in 1990 contained insufficient biological data for new generation DNA technology. The Duluth PD, while expressing willingness to monitor the file, could not allocate resources to a case lacking the most critical legal component, evidence confirming the victim was dead or attacked. Throughout 2001-2010, Laura's file was opened a few times during the Cold Case Unit's annual reviews, but each time it closed with the same conclusion: no body, no DNA samples, no new evidence. All the era's technological advances remained inapplicable to a disappearance missing core traces. Laura Houghton stayed on the long list of unsolved disappearances in northern Minnesota, awaiting a breakthrough that the 2001-2010 period still could not deliver. In 2011, a systemic change swept through the entire St. Louis County when the Criminal Records Modernization Program was launched to digitize every investigative document from the 1970s through the early 2000s. This was a massive project that required every paper file to be reviewed, categorized, scanned, and entered into a new cold case database, with the goal of making future access, sharing, and cross-referencing of information far easier. Among the thousands of files stored in old metal cabinets, Laura Houghton's missing person case was one of the very first to be converted because the paper documents were in excellent condition and the volume was manageable for quick processing. When it was pulled from storage, Laura's entire file was reopened so every document could be examined before digitization. The detective overseeing the program noted that the file contained the original 1990 report, superior forest search diagrams, notes from witness interviews, early evidence analysis, lists of areas already searched, and dozens of pages of detailed investigative notes related to Grant Halverson. Every document was scanned at high resolution, the originals were preserved in chronological order, and then uploaded to the new database as individually identified PDF files. Physical evidence tied to the disappearance was also removed from storage, inspected for condition, and recatalogued under modern preservation standards. The glove found on Old Thompson Trail was placed in a new moisture-resistant archival box. The forest map, rope, duct tape roll, mud-caked shoes, and items recovered from the cabin were all re-inventoried to 2011 standards. Each piece of evidence received a new barcode label directly linked to the digitized file, ensuring that any detective who opened the electronic record could instantly see exactly where the physical item was stored. The digitization protocol also required new photographs of every piece of evidence in its current state, something that had never been done before. Although none of the evidence was retested at the time, the clear photographs and new classification system made the file far more accessible and ready for future review. A critical part of the digitization process was entering the case into the county's new cold case database, a system that allowed files to be sorted by crime type, geographic location, persons of interest, existing physical evidence, and likelihood of successful reinvestigation. Laura's file was entered under missing persons, suspicious circumstances, with detailed descriptions of the superior forest area, relevant trails and roads, and notes about which items of evidence had been preserved. The system also required a persons of interest field, where Grant Halverson was listed as associated, role unverified. The forensic limitations field plainly stated, no DNA samples, no confirmed biological material, evidence environmentally compromised. This made clear that, even though the file was now fully digitized, the case still faced the same technical forensic barriers it always had. When digitization was complete, Laura Houghton's case officially became part of the new cold case database, a modern system that detectives from any agency in the state could access and review whenever new technology, new leads, or matches with other cases appeared. Although it produced no immediate breakthrough, digitizing the file meant Laura's story was no longer confined to faded paper in an old metal cabinet. It now lived in a searchable, cross-referenceable digital system, ready for connections that might only become possible many years later. In early fall 2021, more than 3 decades after Laura Houghton's file had gone silent in the cold case database, something unexpected happened deep in the Cloquet Valley State Forest, an hour's drive north of Duluth. A local hunter, following a narrow side trail toward a swampy edge of the woods, spotted an object half buried among dry leaves and moss. At first, he thought it was just an animal bone, but its shape made him pause. Right beside it, something small glinted in the late afternoon light, a metal pendant with intricate engraving. Uneasy, the hunter immediately called the St. Louis County Sheriff's Office. When deputies arrived, the area was sealed off, and the crime scene unit began a preliminary examination. The bone fragment was quickly confirmed to be human, not from local wildlife. The discovery site sat on a steep forested slope that dropped into low ground, where decades of rain and snowmelt had eroded the topsoil and exposed things that had been buried or covered long ago. Nearby, the pendant was recovered mostly intact, though the metal had tarnished over time. When technicians gently cleaned the thin layer of dirt from it, they immediately recognized the piece from an old photograph in Laura's file. It was the necklace she always wore, a birthday gift from her mother years earlier. The match was unmistakable. Investigators instantly realized they were standing at a location that could be directly connected to a disappearance that had been frozen for 31 years. The search radius was expanded, the erosion zone was mapped, and additional suspicious items were collected. Despite heavy weathering and natural geological change, this was the most significant find in the case since 1990. The bone fragment and pendant were sealed under modern evidence protocol and rushed to the state lab for analysis, while the investigative team began reviewing every record about Cloquet Valley to see if the area had ever been searched in the original investigation. It had not. The 1990 searches had focused far to the south of Duluth, and there had been no reason at the time to think Laura could have traveled this far north. The appearance of human remains here was therefore a major anomaly. Word of the discovery spread quickly through Duluth PD and St. Louis County. Within hours, Laura Houghton's file was flagged active review, the highest cold case priority, and by the end of that day the case was officially reopened after more than 3 decades. New detectives, along with a few who had worked the original investigation, were assembled to go through the entire digitized file. Old physical evidence was pulled from storage for comparison, especially jewelry and personal items. The Cloquet Valley pendant matched the shape, pattern and dimensions described in the 1990 reports almost perfectly, making a direct connection to Laura virtually certain. For a decades-old case, the sudden appearance of a bone fragment together with an identifiable personal item was enough to transform a no-leads missing person file into one with real forward momentum. Police noted that this was the first decisive new physical evidence they had received since 1990. Evidence that could be linked to a victim's body or to the place where a body had once been. Reopening the case triggered a cascade of tasks, determining whether the bone fragment site was natural ground or had been disturbed, evaluating whether years of storms and erosion had finally exposed it, mapping the location against possible vehicle routes if criminal activity was involved. Most importantly, conducting forensic testing to see if DNA could still be recovered from the bone after all this time. Within days, Laura Houghton's case was back in active investigation status. Although no final conclusions had been reached, the Cloquet Valley discovery completely changed the trajectory of the case from a traceless disappearance to one with a physical location, personal evidence, and the realistic possibility of victim identification. After more than 30 years, it was the moment generations of investigators had hoped for, but hardly dared believe would ever come. A new sign, a spark of light deep in the Minnesota woods, opening the door for a cold case many had assumed would stay forgotten forever. Once the bone fragment and pendant were confirmed as high-value evidence and Laura Houghton's case was officially reopened, the next step was to deploy technologies that simply did not exist in 1990. Chief among them was LiDAR. Duluth PD partnered with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's specialized search team to conduct a full LiDAR scan of the Cloquet Valley discovery area. LiDAR, using laser pulses to create ultra-detailed topographic maps that can see through heavy vegetation, revealed subtle ground disturbances invisible to the naked eye. In just a few hours, technicians produced a 3D model of the entire zone around the bone fragment. On the LiDAR map, multiple depressions, slight mounds, and long linear scars that looked like man-made disturbances stood out. After filtering out noise from tree roots, animal burrows, and natural geologic change, analysts identified 3 areas of abnormally compacted soil consistent with the signature of old burial pits that had collapsed and settled over decades. 2 were on gentle slopes, where rainwater could wash soil and leaf litter downhill, creating new layers on top. The third was near an abandoned side trail about 80 meters from the bone fragment. When investigators walked those 3 spots, they used electrical resistivity meters and ground-penetrating radar, GPR, to examine the subsurface layers. GPR results from one location showed clear stratification disturbance, as if the ground had been dug and refilled long ago. That matched the profile of a grave that had eroded over time. Armed with the GPR data, the team began removing soil in careful layers, documenting moisture, compaction, and color. At roughly 20–30 centimeters down, they encountered a layer of soil mixed with unevenly decomposed organic material, a classic sign of ground that had been disturbed and recompacted unnaturally. 3 separate soil samples were sealed and sent for microscopic analysis to look for cellular remains, tissue structure, or any surviving organic components after decades. In that same area, technicians recovered several microscopic fabric fibers caught in the soil, too short to see without magnification, but under a field microscope, they appeared to be synthetic fibers similar to those used in late 1980s winter jackets. Though it was too soon to say whether the fibers belonged to Laura, everything was collected for further testing. While expanding the search around the second LiDAR-flagged zone, surveyors found an area of unusually dark soil containing ash residue, not campfire ash, because the spot was far from any established trail. Field tests identified it as old, burned plant material, but there was no evidence of intentional fire setting. Still, the presence of charcoal deep in the soil was considered anomalous, since the area had no recorded forest fire in the past 40 years. All ash-containing samples were collected for chemical analysis. At the third site, although the terrain suggested past disturbance, GPR showed the soil had recompacted almost completely naturally, making definitive conclusions harder. Even so, horizontal and vertical soil cores were taken in hopes of trapping microscopic material from the early 1990s. More importantly, investigators flew drones equipped with thermal cameras to detect differences in soil moisture between old and newer ground. The images clearly showed that the first site, the one with a stratified disturbance, had significantly lower moisture than the surrounding area, consistent with soil that had been densely packed and then subjected to decades of freeze-thaw cycles. From the collected samples, the crime scene team also recovered a few more fragments of synthetic material, possibly nylon or polyester, trapped deeper in the soil, very pale and brittle from age. While their origin could not yet be confirmed, they strengthened the hypothesis that the area once contained fabric items. Throughout the search, the team examined every fallen tree, uprooted stump, and seasonally eroded spot. Wind-toppled trees were checked because an old grave can sometimes be exposed when roots rip out of the ground. No additional bone fragments were found in those locations, but the initial bone discovery suggested others may have washed away or dispersed downhill over the decades. Regarding the pendant, technicians examined the surrounding vegetation to determine whether it had fallen where it was found or been carried there from higher ground. A subtle compressed soil feature nearby suggested the pendant had not rolled naturally, but dropped from a higher point on the slope. That led police to believe the true origin point lay farther upslope, in the area already flagged by LiDAR as disturbed. After 2 straight days of intensive survey, the search zone was narrowed to the site, showing clear stratigraphic disturbance, fabric fibers, and anomalous soil. For the first time since 1990, investigators had located a place that could contain direct evidence tied to Laura. Modern technology, GPR, LiDAR, microscopic soil analysis, had unlocked an entirely new layer of information the original investigation could never have reached. And although no final determination had yet been made, identifying a zone of unnaturally compacted soil, recovering fibers from old layers, and linking the bone fragment, the pendant, and the LiDAR anomalies together had turned Cloquet Valley into the focal point of the reopened investigation. A crime scene that time had kept hidden for more than 30 years, now finally beginning to reveal itself. The bone fragment collected at Cloquet Valley was immediately sent to the State Forensic Laboratory in St. Paul for DNA analysis, a step that was completely impossible in 1990 but had become standard procedure in cold cases by 2021. The bone sample, though small and exposed to more than 3 decades of weathering, still retained enough internal structure to extract mitochondrial DNA, a type far more durable than nuclear DNA, and one that often survives much longer in natural environments. The testing team began with a surface cleaning process on the bone fragment to remove soil, bacteria, and environmental contaminants that could interfere with results. A very small portion was then drilled from the inner surface to obtain pure bone powder, avoiding any possibility of contamination from the surrounding environment. The DNA extraction process took several days, requiring multiple repetitions to ensure enough DNA was obtained for comparative analysis. Meanwhile, Duluth PD contacted Laura's family. By this time only a few direct relatives remained in Minnesota and Wisconsin to request reference samples. Laura's sister and a maternal niece voluntarily provided buccal swabs to create DNA reference profiles. Once the mtDNA data was generated, forensic experts proceeded with comparison using the characteristic genetic markers of the mitochondrial system. Because mitochondrial DNA is passed down through the maternal line, a complete match in the mtDNA marker sequence is sufficient to establish that the bone fragment belonged to the same maternal lineage. In the final report, the analysis cycles showed an absolute match between the bone fragment and the DNA samples from Laura's family. There were no errors or variant regions in the examined mtDNA sequence. With this conclusion, the laboratory confirmed that the bone fragment belonged to Laura Houghton with a high degree of scientific certainty, ending more than 30 years of uncertainty about whether she was still alive or dead. When the results were sent back to Duluth PD, the Cloquet Valley Forest area where the bone fragment and pendant had been found was officially designated as a crime scene directly linked to Laura. Although it was not yet possible to determine exactly what had happened at the time of her disappearance in 1990, verifying the identity of the remains meant that Laura was deceased and her body had once been present in that forest. This was the biggest breakthrough since the case was reopened from a decades-long missing person investigation. The case was now reclassified as an unexplained death. Investigators marked Cloquet Valley as the new focal point of the investigation, standardized the search perimeter, established a crime scene map, and treated it as an area requiring expanded excavation. Additionally, the DNA result put an end to any theory that Laura had left voluntarily or met with an accident elsewhere. From this point forward, every line of inquiry had to revolve around one question: how did Laura's body end up in the Cloquet Forest, an area completely off the route she was known to travel and outside all original search zones? Confirming the identity of the bone fragment was not only a crucial clue, but also the painful yet necessary confirmation. Laura Houghton was gone, and the forest where the bone fragment was found was where her life had ended, even though the cause remained unknown. When the DNA results confirmed the bone fragment belonged to Laura Houghton, Duluth PD and the BCA immediately re-examined every sealed piece of evidence from 1990, including a hair sample that had been deemed insufficient for analysis at the time. This hair sample had been recovered from the interior of Laura's vehicle shortly after her disappearance. In 1990, due to limited DNA technology, especially with hair lacking roots, police could not identify its owner or establish its evidentiary value. 3 decades later, with dramatic advances in mitochondrial DNA analysis and techniques for extracting DNA from hair shafts, what had seemed a useless item became one of the case's most important pieces of evidence. The sample consisted of 3 strands, approximately 4–6 centimeters long, found wedged between the driver's seat and the gear shift. Records from 1990 noted that Laura had light-colored hair, whereas the 3 recovered strands were dark brown and thicker in structure. At the time, this was simply recorded as a detail inconsistent with the victim, but no owner could be traced. In 2021, the hair was sent to the BCA's Trace Evidence Laboratory, where advanced polymerase chain reaction techniques were used to extract DNA from the hair shaft. This method allows DNA recovery even when cells have completely degraded, something impossible in the 1990s. The analysis began by thoroughly cleaning each strand to remove all dust, oil, and accumulated contaminants. Technicians used laser microdissection to cut the central portion of the shaft, the area with the highest keratin density, where mitochondrial DNA is most likely to persist long-term. After multiple extractions, they obtained sufficient mtDNA to generate a genetic profile. Meanwhile, Duluth PD obtained a reference sample from Grant Halverson, who was still living in Minnesota when the case was reopened. The reference sample was collected under court order, justified by the fact that he had been a person of interest in the original missing person case, and any old evidence reanalyzed with new technology could require comparison. When the two datasets were compared, the result was immediate and unambiguous. The mtDNA sequence from the hair matched Grant Halverson's mtDNA exactly. There were no discrepancies, no differences in markers, no variant regions. The forensic report stated a certainty level exceeding 99.99%, the highest probability possible with MET-dysony analysis, since mitochondrial DNA is maternally inherited and virtually unchanged across generations. This meant the hair recovered from Laura's car in 1990 belonged to Grant Halverson. When police reviewed the entire case timeline, this discovery carried enormous weight. Grant had stated in 1990 that he did not see Laura the morning she disappeared and had not been inside her car for many weeks prior. That statement was now directly contradicted by physical evidence because Grant's hair could only have been inside Laura's vehicle if he had been present in the narrow window immediately before her disappearance. However, identifying the hair's owner was only part of the analysis. Under scanning electron microscopy, technicians observed that the strands exhibited unnatural breakage. The hairs were not shed naturally, nor stretched and snapped. They showed a blunt force break, the type of fracture typically seen when hair is yanked or subjected to sudden force. The break surfaces were rough, with keratin slightly compressed on one side, indicating lateral force, very different from bending or natural shedding. This pattern is consistent with hair pulled during a struggle or physical altercation. This was indirect, but significant evidence that the hair did not fall through ordinary contact, but through violent interaction between Grant and Laura or in a confrontational situation. Technicians also checked whether the hair had been cut with a sharp instrument, but CM showed no signs of mechanical cutting. That reinforced the hypothesis that the strands were forcibly pulled or torn out by significant force. When police cross-referenced this evidence with the full case file, a very different picture emerged compared to the initial investigation. Laura disappeared in 1990 under circumstances deemed suspicious. She had complained about Grant's controlling, stalking, and threatening behavior. She had shown small behavioral changes, looking around the yard before getting into her car, appearing anxious when the phone rang, and telling family she no longer felt safe. Grant had given inconsistent statements, lacked a verifiable alibi, and could not explain why he was driving around that morning. Grant's hair in Laura's car, combined with the unnatural breakage, now became concrete proof that he had been in her environment very close to the time she vanished, and more importantly, that he had physical contact with her under potentially violent circumstances. Police then re-examined the 1990 vehicle search report to pinpoint exactly where the hair was found. Notes showed it was lodged in the crevice between the driver's seat and the gear shift, a location likely to retain evidence if there had been pushing, struggling, or someone leaning across the seat to reach the wheel or driver. This was not a spot where hair would naturally fall from clothing or the passenger seat without unusual movement. When combined with the confirmed bone fragment proving Laura was dead, the Cloquet Valley Forest established as the location where her remains had been, and her pendant discovered there, Grant's hair became the strongest direct link between him and Laura's disappearance. Even more critically, the breakage pattern fit the model of escalation to physical confrontation, a common characteristic in domestic violence cases that end in disappearance or death. Using 2021 technology, the team also applied techniques to detect keratin protein altered by pulling force, confirming the hair experienced violent stress shortly before detachment. This indicated the violent contact did not occur days earlier, but very close to the moment Laura vanished. From a piece of evidence forgotten in the files for over 3 decades, the 3 hairs trapped in Laura's car had become powerful forensic evidence, placing Grant Halverson at the absolute center of the case with unprecedented precision. It not only confirmed his presence in Laura's vehicle, but confirmed violent physical contact immediately before her disappearance, a detail that shifted the entire focus of the investigation and left Grant with no escape. After the DNA results from the hair sample pointed to Grant Halverson's presence in Laura's car, along with signs of violent contact, Duluth PD and the BCA decided to fully reconstruct Laura's movements on the day she disappeared using all the new data, a task that had been impossible in 1990. The goal was to connect the original evidence locations to the 2021 remains discovery site, model the most plausible travel route, and test whether the timeline matched Grant's statements. The reconstruction began by re-establishing the complete geographic context of 1990. Old maps of Duluth and the Superior Forest were rebuilt from historical satellite imagery, land survey data, forestry reports, and late 1980s traffic maps. Because many roads from 1990 had been widened, rerouted, or closed, the team had to cross-reference modern maps with archived records to pinpoint exactly which routes existed at the time. The first step was establishing key landmarks. Landmark 1, Laura's home in Duluth. Landmark 2, the route she normally took to Lakeview Pet Boarding. Landmark 3, the location where the glove was found on Old Thompson Trail, a detail once considered vague but now potentially significant for positioning. Landmark 4, the Cloquet Valley Forest area, where the bone fragment and pendant were discovered. Landmark 5, the secondary roads Grant Halverson might have used. Based on his 1990 statement that he was just driving around to relax. When modeling possible routes, investigators quickly realized that traveling to Cloquet Valley was completely outside Laura's known patterns, but perfectly feasible if someone else, particularly Grant, had taken her there. The route models were built on 3 main factors: time, accessibility, and plausibility, from the perspective of someone intent on control or violence. First, the team examined the window between when Laura left home and when her family grew worried and called police. Estimated at 45 to 90 minutes, enough time to divert Laura from the main road, drive into the forest, have a confrontation, and reach Cloquet Valley. One modeled route showed that if Grant intercepted Laura near a quiet intersection in Duluth, transferred her to his vehicle, or forced her to drive a different direction, he could reach the edge of Cloquet Valley in 25 to 40 minutes, depending on 1990 road conditions. This fit perfectly with Grant's empty alibi. He could not account for his whereabouts during that exact window. When the glove's location was factored in, the team noticed that Old Thompson Trail lay on an indirect path from Duluth to Cloquet Valley if lesser-used back roads were taken. Many small forest roads from that era no longer appear on modern maps, but 1989 forestry maps confirm they were active when the disappearance occurred. This meant the glove could have been dropped during forced transport or while Laura attempted to escape the vehicle. Next, the team modeled Grant's likely movement based on average 1990 pickup truck speeds on winter dirt roads, 20-30 miles per hour, factoring in turns, side road choices, and routes designed to avoid notice. The model showed Grant had ample time to reach the later bone fragment location. More importantly, the timeline also indicated that if Grant attempted to return to populated areas after taking Laura to Cloquet Valley, he could still be back in Duluth within a window that made his 1990 statement not immediately suspicious, especially since police then had no traffic cameras or cell phone data to track movement. Another factor incorporated into the modeling was geology. The bone fragment site was in a low-lying, erosion-prone area, consistent with the theory that the body was originally placed higher up and migrated downward over the years due to rain and snow. This led the team to reconstruct the most likely original placement site before decomposition and natural movement occurred. Results pointed to an area near a spot flagged by LiDAR as having stratified soil layers, highly likely to have once held the body or a shallow burial. When cross-referenced with 1990 maps, investigators discovered this location was only 400 meters from a packed dirt forest road, entirely accessible to a pickup truck. This strengthened the hypothesis that Grant could have driven in on a side road, carried Laura a few hundred meters deeper, and then left. Another critical step was comparing the modeled route to Grant Haverson's 1990 statements. In the original file, Grant claimed he only drove around the Duluth area, but provided no specific locations and had no witnesses placing him in populated or public places. When reconstructed using the new data, investigators found the route he could have taken passed through areas with no stores, no security cameras, and virtually no winter traffic. The deeper they looked, the more logical it became that Grant's statement did not rule out a trip to Cloquet Valley. In fact, his absence from any busy location that morning aligned perfectly with the modeled route. From there, the reconstruction team produced a final timeline: the minute Laura left home, the possible confrontation window, the drive to Cloquet Valley, the moment the body or remains could have been placed, and Grant's return trip. Everything fit within a reasonable time frame with no conflicts in timing or location. When all variables were combined, the 1990 evidence locations, the hair DNA results, the 2021 bone fragment site, LiDAR terrain data, the timeline model, and road characteristics, the reconstruction revealed a single highly plausible journey. A journey that for 30 years had no evidence to disprove, but now, with modern technology, every piece fell into place as one logical route from the home Laura left to the intersection with Grant, to the glove left on Old Thompson Trail, and finally to Cloquet Valley, where her body ended its journey in silence for more than 3 decades. When the reconstruction of the route, the DNA results from the hair sample, and the verification of the remains all pointed in the same direction, the Duluth Police Department, Duluth PD, and the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, BCA, decided to expand the investigation phase by re-interviewing witnesses who had been spoken to in 1990. This time applying the cognitive interview technique, a scientifically based method for deeper memory retrieval that allows witnesses to recover details previously forgotten or not properly activated. The investigators understood that human memory is not a video recording of events, but a network of associations between images, sounds, sensations, and context. Many details thought to be lost forever can be revived when the witness is placed in the exact state of recall, without leading or pressure. The new interview phase focused on people who lived near Old Thompson Trail and the surrounding side areas along the route Laura traveled on the morning she disappeared. Many of them had aged more than 30 years, but memories of the incident were still somewhere in their minds, needing only the right approach to unlock them. The investigation team began by inviting witnesses into a quiet, pressure-free environment, asking them to close their eyes and reconstruct the context of that winter morning in 1990 in sensory order. The cold on their face, the sound of the wind, the distant noise of vehicles, the dim light from an overcast sky. Once placed back in that context, one witness who had previously given a rather vague statement might have seen some vehicle pass by, suddenly remembered that the vehicle was actually a red pickup truck that looked fairly old. Following cognitive interview protocol, the investigator did not bombard with questions, but let the witness freely describe any detail that surfaced, no matter how small or seemingly unimportant. When asked to recount the event in reverse order from end to beginning, a technique known to activate overlooked memory fragments, the witness recalled even more clearly that the pickup appeared to slow down when it approached a turnoff onto a small trail inside Old Thompson Trail. In the 1990 statement, the witness had only said they were not sure about the type of vehicle, but with the cognitive interview, they described it quite clearly: a pickup with a long bed, some scratches on the right side, and an engine sound that was heavier than normal. These details immediately caught the team's attention because Grant Halverson's 1990 vehicle records showed he owned an older red Chevrolet pickup with a long bed and a large scratch on the right rear door area, documented in a minor accident report from the summer before Laura disappeared. Another witness, who lived a few hundred meters from a side road off Old Thompson Trail, was also re-interviewed using the new technique. In 1990, this person only remembered an unusual engine noise that morning. In the 2021 interview, when asked to recreate the sound in their memory, they described it as like a truck running unevenly, possibly bad spark plugs or air filter. When cross-referenced with Grant's vehicle maintenance records, police discovered his truck had been noted by a mechanic for heavy running engine and vibration on light throttle, an unexpected but significant match. Another witness, asked to describe the view from their window that morning, recalled that the red pickup heading toward the trail appeared to have something or someone obscured in the bed or on the passenger side. Though they couldn't be certain after so many years, they clearly stated the truck was not a stranger's vehicle, but one they had seen multiple times around the neighborhood in previous years, and when shown photos of several late 1980s pickup models, they correctly identified the exact make and model Grant had owned. The cognitive interview process continued to yield additional fragmented but valuable memory pieces. One person who walked their dog near the forest trail recalled that the snow at the time showed a wider than normal tire track impression, a detail they hadn't mentioned in 1990 because they thought it irrelevant. Another remembered hearing a metallic squeak when the truck bed gate was closed and the sound of the vehicle suddenly accelerating northward, matching the direction toward Cloquet Valley. When all the new statements were compiled, the analysis team created a map recording the frequency of red pickup sightings in witnesses' memories. The result showed a convergence zone between Old Thompson Trail and the side road leading north, where the vehicle was described most often. Coincidentally, this was also the area near where the glove was found, an area no one in 1990 had been able to connect. From there, police directly compared the witnesses' descriptions with Grant Halverson's 1990 vehicle records. Red color, long bed, scratch on the right side, heavy and vibrating engine sound, and frequent presence in the side forest areas on weekends. Every detail matched, not a single detail contradicted. More importantly, no other vehicle in the area at that time had similar characteristics. When the investigation team re-examined Grant's statement that he had just driven around Duluth that morning, they recognized a key point: with modern interview techniques and activated memories, witnesses had inadvertently contradicted Grant's account. The details they recalled not only reinforced the timeline, route, and forensic data, but also placed Grant's vehicle near the route Laura took on the exact morning she disappeared. Combining the cognitive interview results with the route simulation created a powerful evidentiary axis: the presence of a red pickup near the trail, matching Grant's vehicle perfectly, combined with Grant's hair in Laura's car, signs of violent contact, the location of the bone fragment and pendant. Everything converged on the same investigative conclusion: the red pickup was the only reasonable vehicle connecting every point from where Laura left home to where her remains were found. And that vehicle belonged to Grant Halverson. After the witness statements recovered through cognitive interview and a series of new data placed Grant Halverson in the area near Old Thompson Trail on the morning Laura disappeared, Duluth PD and BCA proceeded to the next step, obtaining a second comprehensive search warrant for Grant's home. This time, based on clear legal evidence they did not have in 1990. The warrant was quickly approved by the court, citing three critical factors: DNA from the hair sample matching Grant with near absolute certainty, the location of Laura's remains linked to the route where Grant's vehicle was seen, and new witness statements confirming a red pickup matching his vehicle near the trail at the time of the disappearance. The search took place on a cold, early winter morning in 2021. Grant lived in a small house on the outskirts of Duluth, far from the city center and dense residential areas. The house had a large garage, a basement full of old items, and a small shed in the back, all within the scope of the warrant. Investigators prioritized the basement, hoping to find items from the 1990s still stored there. As Minnesota cold case experience showed, basements are often where homeowners keep old belongings they never discard. When the basement lights were turned on, the search team saw dozens of dusty cardboard boxes, many warped or moldy with age. Most contained miscellaneous junk, old books, work tools, work clothing, damaged documents. However, in the deepest corner, they discovered a large black plastic bin, tightly sealed, but showing signs of having been opened relatively recently. Dust on the lid was disturbed, and faint fingerprints were visible on the plastic. When the bin was brought into the light, it revealed numerous old outdoor activity items: a torn pair of gloves, a folding knife with a rusted blade, old rope, a few climbing carabiners, and notably, a synthetic jacket with the left sleeve cut off. Of particular note, stuck in the corner of the bin were several small gray-blue fabric fibers clinging to the edge of the rope, and a piece of broken plastic. Investigators immediately seized everything for analysis because the color and material of the fibers stood out. Laura Houghton was wearing a gray-blue winter jacket the morning she left home, a detail confirmed by family in the original file. These fibers were sealed on-site in specialized evidence bags and sent to the BCA lab. Next to the cut-sleeve jacket, investigators found an old plastic bag marked with the date 1993 in marker. Inside was a tattered Superior National Forest map with pencil circles around side roads that no longer exist on modern maps. Some circled markings corresponded to areas between Old Thompson Trail and the road to Cloquet Valley. When compared to the digitally reconstructed map, those markings aligned with the region where LiDAR had detected ground disturbance. This led the team to believe the map fragment had been used by Grant around the time of the disappearance and later cut up to avoid detection if searched. Additionally, in a nearby wooden crate, investigators found an old rubber boot caked with dried mud. The type of mud visually similar to the 2021 Cloquet Valley soil samples. Though the mud was dry and no longer viable for DNA, the clay and gravel mixture matched the geological profile of Cloquet Valley more than the Duluth area. This discovery, while not directly legally conclusive, reinforced the location model of where Grant may have gone in 1990. When the team moved to the garage, they found a metal box containing old vehicle items, including a key for a late 1980s Chevrolet pickup, the exact model Grant once owned. The key was rusted at the tip, but still bore the recognizable Chevrolet logo. It was not direct evidence, but it showed Grant had kept items related to the vehicle, possibly used in the disappearance. Notably, in an overhead cabinet, the team found a small bag containing thin tie straps and several broken pieces of rubber cord. On one piece of cord, investigators noticed a few very short light-colored hairs, though relevance was unclear at the time. Everything was seized for analysis. While checking behind the house, the team discovered a rotted wooden box partially buried in the soil, containing even more old camping gear. A lighter, pieces of nylon tarp, a half-burned wooden handle, scraps of synthetic fabric with burned edges. All were covered in thick dirt, but were collected because they could relate to evidence disposal or items used after Laura's disappearance. However, the most important item from the entire search was in that first plastic bin. The fibers found there not only matched the color of Laura's jacket, but also had the same weave structure used by popular late 1980s winter jacket manufacturers. When examined on-site with a specialized magnifier, investigators saw that some fiber edges were frayed in a manner typical of fabric being pulled hard or scraped against a rough surface, entirely consistent with the violent contact pattern inferred from the broken hair sample. When everything recovered from the search was compiled, old forest-related gear, rope, cut-sleeve jacket, torn forest map, fibers matching Laura's clothing, Cloquet Valley mud, outdoor equipment, old pickup key, and hairs mixed in the cords. The investigation team realized they had found a critical link, a cache of items Grant had used in the early 1990s that likely contained traces of what happened to Laura. Individually, none of the items constituted absolute proof, but taken as a group alongside the forensic data, rote reconstruction, witness memories and DNA results, they transformed Grant Halverson's house into an important supplementary crime scene, a past point still preserved, where what happened on a winter day in 1990 remained imprinted in dust, in fabric, and in objects he thought had faded into oblivion. After the 2021 search yielded numerous valuable items of evidence, Duluth PD and BCA decided to place Grant Halverson under continuous surveillance for 3 straight weeks to assess his reactions, behavior, and any unusual movements after being placed under renewed suspicion. Although Grant did not know the full extent of the investigation's progress, the presence of law enforcement at his home and the seizure of a large number of old items were enough to unsettle anyone who had concealed past actions. The surveillance team consisted of experienced investigators using discreet methods combined with modern technology, vehicle-mounted cameras, license plate tracking systems on main roads, and logging every stop, visit, and social interaction Grant made during the surveillance period. From the very first week, the team noticed a clear change in Grant's routine. He became irregular in his habits, leaving home earlier, driving to areas not part of his previous daily patterns, and tending to turn off his phone or leave it at home when going out. None of this broke the law, but it reflected a behavioral pattern often seen in subjects who feel they are at risk of exposure. In the first few days, Grant made multiple trips to hardware stores, purchasing small items such as industrial trash bags, chemical cleaning rags, and disposable rubber gloves. Although these items could serve ordinary household purposes, the frequency and specific choices were logged as unusual behavior, especially in the context of the recent search. Even more notably, Grant began driving into scattered forest areas around Duluth in the late afternoon or early evening, sometimes stopping for only a few minutes before turning around and leaving. When mapped, these locations had one thing in common: they were remote, low-traffic areas near side forest roads. The surveillance team wondered whether Grant was checking whether any traces remained in those areas, a common behavior among offenders who previously handled a crime scene and now feared rediscovery. In the second week, Grant's behavior became even more noteworthy. He ventured into areas increasingly farther away, including some forest regions between Duluth and Cloquet Valley. This geographic overlap directly matched behavioral analysis profiles for concealing evidence. Many offenders, when feeling threatened, returned to places where they left traces to check or move evidence. Although Grant carried no shovels or large tools, his short stops, typically 3 to 7 minutes, on narrow forest roads were consistent with scene assessment rather than scene alteration. Another observation in the second week was that he began looking around carefully when visiting stores or public areas, as if sensing he was being watched. These behaviors not only showed unusually high vigilance, but also aligned with the psychological profile of someone hiding a long-term secret now under pressure. In the third week, the surveillance team recorded one particularly significant action. Grant drove to a private landfill on the outskirts, but did not discard anything substantial. Instead, he stopped near the industrial dumpsters for a few minutes without putting anything in, then left. This is a common behavior in individuals testing a potential evidence disposal location or checking for surveillance cameras before taking further suspicious action. In addition to tracking activity, the team analyzed Grant's repeated stops. He visited 3 times an area on the edge of a side branch of Cloquet Valley, not far from where the bone fragment was found in 2021. Each stop was brief, and he carried no obvious tools, but returning to the exact area tied to the investigation was a particularly noteworthy red flag. Additionally, Grant's tone and demeanor during necessary social interactions were noted. He became more guarded, gave short answers, and sometimes appeared flustered by simple questions at stores. These signs were assessed by the Behavioral Analysis Unit as consistent with high stress, the type often seen in subjects who suspect their past secret is about to be exposed. The surveillance team found no new criminal acts, but they continuously compiled data on movements, timing, and behavior to build a psychological profile, one that showed Grant was far from carefree or calm as he claimed in 1990. He was anxious, hypervigilant, and especially inclined to revisit areas that lay along the disappearance route. This strongly matched the offender returns pattern, criminals returning to old scenes when threatened by the possible existence of traces they are unsure were fully erased. When the 3 weeks of surveillance were combined with information from the search, the items in the old storage bin, the hair evidence showing violent contact, the cognitive interview witness statements, and the remains location, investigators had a consistent picture. Grant Halverson was not only connected to the 1990 disappearance, but was now displaying a series of behaviors reflecting concealment, fear of discovery, and attempts to control information around key locations. For 30 years, his silence had not been a sign of innocence, but part of a prolonged concealment pattern, and now, under the light of new technology and evidence, that pattern was becoming clearly visible. After 3 weeks of continuous surveillance and having gathered sufficient legal grounds, Duluth PD and BCA decided to summon Grant Halverson to headquarters for the first round of interrogation. Although not yet under arrest, Grant was invited to cooperate as a material witness in a reopened missing person case, but the entire investigative team knew that this session was the critical step to directly confront his current statements with the complete 1990 case file. Grant arrived appearing to maintain his composure, yet the tension in his gait and his avoidance of eye contact clearly revealed that he knew exactly why he was there. The investigators began with what seemed like simple questions, asking him to recount the sequence of the morning Laura disappeared, exactly as he had stated in 1990. Grant repeated the familiar narrative: he had been driving around to relax, did not see Laura, did not go near the Superior Forest, and knew nothing about her disappearance. This time, however, the investigators were not merely listening, they were cross-checking every word against the evidence they now possessed. Newly seized physical items, DNA evidence, witness statements refreshed through cognitive interview technique, and the 2021 route reconstruction. When asked which direction he had driven that morning, Grant gave the same vague answer as 3 decades earlier: south of Duluth. The investigator then produced a 1990 map and asked him to mark the exact route. Grant hesitated, then randomly selected a route that the team already knew did not match either the timeline or the direction of travel described by witnesses who saw a red pickup truck. This was the first major inconsistency. His statement did not align with any plausible route during the period for which he had no alibi. Next, the investigator asked whether he had been inside Laura's vehicle at any point in the week before she vanished. Grant answered emphatically, just as he had in 1990, no. The investigator immediately presented the 2021 DNA report from hair recovered inside Laura's car. They did not reveal the full document, but informed him that the hair belonged to him with near absolute certainty. Grant was visibly stunned. For several seconds, his composure wavered before he regained control and claimed it could be old hair from weeks earlier. This explanation contradicted the forensic finding that the location of the hair could only have resulted from close contact shortly before it was shed. This was the second major inconsistency. He denied contact, yet the DNA and the hair's placement proved the opposite. The investigator then turned to the red pickup truck. Grant insisted he never left Duluth and never went near Old Thompson Trail. The team, however, had prepared fresh witness statements recovered through cognitive interview. Without naming the witnesses, they described 3 specific details: a red long bed pickup truck with a scratch on the right side. They then asked, "Did you own a vehicle matching that exact description in 1990? Grant was forced to reluctantly admit that yes, he had owned exactly such a truck. This was the third major inconsistency. His claim of never being near the forest trail was incompatible with the witness descriptions and the route reconstruction. When the questioning moved to the Cloquet Valley State Forest area, Grant continued to insist he had never been there. At that point, the interrogation team presented a series of foundational facts: bone fragments belonging to Laura, her pendant recovered at the forest edge, and the forest map seized from Grant's home containing handwritten markings that matched the exact locations where LiDAR had detected disturbed soil. Grant became defensive, claiming the map is just an old one, but this conflicted with the discovery that the markings had been added after Laura disappeared. This was the fourth major inconsistency. He denied ever being in the area, yet the physical evidence and the map suggested otherwise. When asked about the old box in the basement, containing a jacket with cut sleeves, fabric fibers, rope and other forest-related items, Grant said, "Those are just old camping things, but fibers in the box matched the fabric of the jacket Laura was wearing the day she vanished." He could not explain why material matching Laura's clothing was in his possession. This was the fifth, and one of the hardest to defend, inconsistencies. Throughout the entire first interrogation round, the team's goal was not to obtain a confession, but to confront and document. They wanted Grant to talk, and with every sentence they watched for fluctuations, illogic, and weaknesses. Another significant contradiction emerged when the investigators asked why. During the 3 weeks of recent surveillance, Grant had repeatedly visited multiple forest locations. Grant claimed he was walking to relieve stress, but when compared with the surveillance log, every location he visited had a geographic connection to the 1990 disappearance. This was the sixth major inconsistency. His current behavior did not match his statements or his normal routine. At the end of the session, the investigators compiled the contradictions for the record. Grant could not explain why his hair was in Laura's car, could not prove his route on the morning of 1990, denied being on Old Thompson Trail despite witness confirmation of his truck, denied any connection to Cloquet Valley despite evidence found there, could not explain items in his home matching Laura's clothing material, and could not account for his unusual travel patterns in the past 3 weeks. The first interrogation ended without a confession, but with a file now thick with contradictions. As the investigators left the room, their conclusion was clearer than ever: the 1990 statements, the 2021 statements, and the objective evidence could not coexist on the same axis of truth. Grant Haverson had lied, and those contradictions would become the foundation for the next phase of the investigation. The second interrogation took place just 3 days after the first. Enough time for the team to compile the contradictions, cross-reference route maps, finalize the forensic report on the fabric fibers recovered from the old box, and prepare stronger evidence that would leave Grant Haverson no room to maneuver. Grant agreed to return to the interview room. This time he appeared noticeably more tense, his eyes wary and his responses guarded with every question. In contrast to round 1, which had focused on discrepancies between old and new statements, round 2 was built entirely around new forensic evidence, facts the team knew Grant could not dismiss with simple denial. The session opened with the investigators showing Grant the BCA laboratory fabric analysis report. The investigator read slowly. The gray-blue fibers found in Grant's old box had weave structure, synthetic fiber type, and stitching pattern identical to the exact line of winter jacket Laura Houghton was wearing the day she left home in 1990. Confirmed by family photographs and the original purchase receipt. When asked to explain why matching fabric was in his box, Grant reacted defensively, first saying "I don't know," then shifting to "maybe I once took her jacket to be repaired," and later to "maybe she left it in my truck sometime earlier." Each time Grant offered a new version, the investigators immediately countered with authenticated records. They reminded him that he had explicitly stated, "I had not been in Laura's car for many weeks before she disappeared." They also reminded him that Laura and Grant were separated at the time of the disappearance, and there was no reason for Laura to leave personal items in his house or vehicle. Grant's shifting answers were recorded as attempts to create an alternative narrative, each of which collapsed under objective facts. When questioned about the forest map with hand-drawn routes circling secondary trails near Cloquet Valley, Grant said the map was just for hunting, then changed to "it's not even my map," and later to "maybe I picked it up somewhere." The investigators immediately presented forensic findings. The map bore oil stains matching the type of machine oil regularly on Grant's tools, consistent with samples taken from his garage. They also pointed out that the pencil markings were made with the exact brand and hardness of pencil found in Grant's 1990 toolbox, a small but devastating detail that destroyed the new narrative he was trying to build. Faced with this evidence, Grant began to waffle, repeatedly saying, "I don't clearly remember," the classic response of someone whose story is no longer logically controllable. Next, the investigators presented analysis of the mud on an old pair of rubber boots found in a wooden box outside the shed. The mud's mineral composition matched the clay soil of Cloquet Valley, a type not found in the Duluth residential area. When asked why that specific mud was on his boots, Grant offered 3 successive versions: he had gone hiking, gone deer hunting, and finally, "I'm not even sure those boots are mine." Each answer lacked credibility and contradicted the others. The investigators tightened the circle by reminding him that in 1990, he had stated he never went to Cloquet Valley at all, yet the physical evidence in his home said the opposite. For the first time in the session, Grant appeared so rattled that he could not maintain the same answer for 2 consecutive minutes. When the investigators returned to the DNA hair evidence, Grant tried another new narrative. Could the hair have fallen out long before, or stuck to his clothing and accidentally transferred to Laura's car? The investigators presented the forensic report on the hair's break pattern, abrupt fracture consistent with being forcibly pulled, not natural shedding. That narrative collapsed instantly. Grant shifted again, saying, "Maybe we argued," then quickly corrected to, "No, I mean sometimes we raised our voices." This directly contradicted his original 1990 statement that they had no significant conversation before the day she disappeared. The team continued cross-referencing with the 3-week surveillance behavior. When asked why he had visited multiple forest locations, including areas near Cloquet Valley, Grant said he was out thinking, then changed to driving without knowing where I was going, and finally to looking for fishing spots. But the surveillance team had complete logs of times, locations, and street camera angles. Every place he stopped had a geographic link to the reconstructed 1990 disappearance route. That narrative also collapsed against objective data. By the 3rd hour of the interrogation, Grant's instability was unmistakable. Every time he was confronted with forensic evidence, he changed his story, sometimes denying something he had said minutes earlier. This was a clear sign of cognitive overload, when someone trying to defend a false narrative no longer has the capacity to keep the pieces aligned. To force him to face reality, the investigators employed the block contradiction technique, listing every contradiction he had created just in that session: the forest map story, the boot story, the fabric story, the pickup truck story, the hair story, and the 1990 morning route story. Grant could not refute a single point because every detail was backed by forensic science, geographic data, or independent witness statements. At the height of tension, Grant attempted one last narrative: Laura might have gotten a ride with someone else, but this was immediately dismantled, because the bone fragments, pendant, and route reconstruction all aligned only with locations where witnesses had placed Grant's truck. He then switched to "I don't remember that day," but the investigators pointed out that a person cannot simultaneously not remember and be certain he never saw the victim. That narrative was swiftly eliminated. By the end of the session, Grant had almost no capacity left to maintain a coherent account. He kept repeating that everything is just coincidence, to which the investigator replied, "You are facing a chain of coincidences so long that it does not exist in reality." And that was the truth. Forensics, crime scene evidence, witnesses, the map, fabric samples, surveillance behavior, and route modeling, all converged on a single point. The second interrogation ended without a confession, but it was clear that Grant Halverson had failed to construct any alternative narrative that could withstand scientific evidence and real-world data. The contradictions he created only strengthened the investigative conclusion. He had not merely lied, he had lied to conceal an act he never believed would be exposed after 30 years. Following the second interrogation, with every contradiction documented and every narrative Grant attempted completely demolished by objective evidence, Duluth PD and BCA entered the comprehensive evaluation phase to submit the case to the St. Louis County Attorney's Office. In a report exceeding 100 pages, the investigative team listed every element forming a strong legal basis for an arrest warrant, DNA from the hair matching Grant Haverson with near absolute certainty, hair break characteristics consistent with violent contact, fabric fibers from the old box matching the exact jacket Laura wore on the day she vanished. Laura's remains located in Cloquet Valley, along with her DNA-confirmed personal pendant. The forest map with markings matching LiDAR-detected soil disturbance. Grant's abnormal travel patterns during the 3 weeks of surveillance, and continuously changing statements containing numerous unexplainable contradictions. Most crucially, the reconstructed timeline of December 1990 showed Grant had the time, the vehicle, and the opportunity to take Laura off her normal route and to the area where her remains were later found. From a legal standpoint, the 2021 file was no longer a missing person case, but a death investigation supported by forensic evidence in which Grant was the only individual directly linked to every single piece of evidence. Based on these factors, the St. Louis County Attorney's Office accepted the full report and initiated the process to obtain an arrest warrant under Minnesota procedure. When the prosecutors reached the section stating not a single piece of evidence in the case points to any individual other than Grant Haverson, the decision became clear. The arrest warrant was signed less than 24 hours after the file was submitted. The following morning, the investigative team, coordinated with the county SWAT unit, executed the arrest at Grant's residence. Although Grant had no violent criminal history in the past 30 years, the case file indicated a potential for unstable reaction under pressure, so deployment of the tactical team was deemed necessary for everyone's safety. At approximately 6:15 a.m., as Grant stepped onto his front porch, SWAT approached simultaneously from front and rear. He appeared shocked, barely managing to speak before being informed of the arrest warrant and the legal grounds related to the death of Laura Houghton. There was no resistance, but in his eyes was unmistakable collapse, a mixture of panic and the realization that 3 decades of concealment had come to an end. Grant was handcuffed, read his Miranda rights, and placed in a patrol car in heavy silence. Neighbors watched from a distance, many stunned because Grant had always been regarded as a quiet, unremarkable resident, but for the investigative team, the decision was not based on recent behavior alone. It was the culmination, the convergence of 30 years of scattered evidence finally connected into an unbreakable chain of logic. At the St. Louis County Jail, Grant was booked, medically screened, and isolated from the general population per protocol for serious cases. The arrest record stated clearly, suspect, Grant Haverson. Charges supported by DNA evidence, forensic physical evidence, simulated timeline, evidence concealment behavior, contradictory statements. Outside, Duluth PD released a brief press statement confirming that the 1990 Laura Houghton missing person case had officially become a criminal homicide investigation with a suspect in custody. No details were disclosed, but it emphasized that the breakthrough resulted from the combination of modern forensic technology, digitized historical records, and the persistence of multiple generations of investigators. The arrest of Grant Haverson not only ended the field investigation phase but opened a new one, the phase in which all forensic evidence, behavioral data, timeline reconstruction, and statements would enter the formal justice system. With Grant now in custody, the Laura Houghton case turned to the chapter her family, 30 years earlier, had scarcely dared hope for. The chapter of facing the truth, Immediately after Grant Halverson was arrested and placed in custody, the St. Louis County Prosecutor's Office formally took over the entire investigative file to prepare for the prosecution phase of prosecution. A process considered complex and sensitive due to the nature of a case that had stretched over more than 3 decades and lacked a complete victim's body. The chief prosecutor, who had handled numerous cold cases in the state, began by reviewing the fully digitized case file, which included investigative reports from 1990, maps of search areas, historical witness statements, modern forensic analyses, simulated timelines, and newly seized physical evidence from 2021. The prosecution team's first task was to categorize the evidence into legal groups: direct evidence, circumstantial evidence, forensic evidence, behavioral evidence, and timeline evidence. In the direct evidence category, they placed the bone fragment and Laura's pendant, items that proved she was dead and had been present at Cloquet Valley. Although not a complete body, these items were sufficient to establish death under Minnesota legal standards, an essential requirement for prosecuting murder in a no-body case. Next, the forensic evidence group was regarded as the most critical pillar. DNA from hair recovered in Laura's car matched Grant's DNA. The hair showed fracture patterns indicating violent contact. Fabric fibers found in Grant's old storage box matched the type of jacket Laura wore on the day she disappeared. A forest map with markings matched the area where LiDAR identified disturbed soil. Soil samples on Grant's boots were consistent with Cloquet Valley soil. Each individual element could be questioned in isolation, but together they formed an unbreakable chain, showing Grant had direct contact with both the crime scene and the victim. The prosecutors paid particular attention to the behavioral evidence group, considered the key to convincing a jury in no-body cases. They compiled every inconsistency in Grant's statements over 3 decades, especially the constant changes during his 2021 interrogation, his monitoring of forest areas in the 3 weeks before his arrest, his attempts to construct new inconsistent narratives, and his retention of case-related items in an old storage box. These elements were cataloged under motive, opportunity, and consciousness of guilt, the awareness of wrongdoing, and attempts to conceal it. The timeline evidence was also scrutinized in detail. Route simulations concluded Grant had sufficient time and means to take Laura to Cloquet Valley. He could not establish an alibi, and 2021 witness testimony confirmed a red pickup was seen near Old Thompson Trail on the morning Laura vanished. The prosecutors assessed the case's strengths. The DNA was scientifically irrefutable. The bone fragment confirmed the victim was dead. Items in the old storage box linked Grant to Laura's clothing. 2021 witness statements gained credibility through cognitive interview techniques. And Grant's behavior fit the pattern of a perpetrator attempting to conceal a crime. However, they also candidly evaluated weaknesses the defense could exploit: no complete body, no direct eyewitness to the event, and no specific traces of violence at the home or in Laura's vehicle. In no-body homicide cases, the prosecution strategy must focus on 2 things: proving the victim is dead and proving the defendant is the only person with motive, opportunity, and direct connection to the scene. The bone fragment, confirmed by DNA to be Laura's, satisfied the first requirement. The rest was established through forensic, behavioral, and testimonial evidence. The prosecutors planned to build the case around an irrefutable logical chain in which every piece of evidence, even if not direct proof of the killing itself, fit together to form a complete picture. That picture demonstrated no one other than Grant could have taken Laura to Cloquet Valley, no one else left physical traces in her car, and no one else kept fabric from her clothing for 3 decades. They anticipated the defense strategy would center on denying a direct link between Grant and the moment of Laura's death, or arguing the bone fragment could have been dragged there by animals, or that the hair only proved prior contact. The prosecution prepared rebuttals using forensic reports. The bone fragment was found immediately adjacent to the disturbed soil. Not in an area animals typically traverse. Hair fracture characteristics proved violence near the time of loss, and the simulated travel route matched the disappearance timeline. Additionally, Grant's continual changes of story and his recent forest monitoring behavior would be used to demonstrate consciousness of guilt, a powerful factor in nobody cases. The prosecution team also requested the BCA prepare expert materials to explain to the jury the reliability of mitochondrial DNA, microscopic fiber analysis, and soil stratification models in old burial pits, reducing the risk of technical attacks by the defense. During prosecution preparation, the lead prosecutor held multiple closed-door meetings with the chief investigator to cross-check every detail. Timelines, locations, forensics, witness statements, and an overall case roadmap from 1990 to 2021. Their goal was to present the case not as a series of suspicions, but as a logical, seamless, and consistent sequence of events, a structure that even without a complete body, possessed legal solidity sufficient to convince an entire jury. As prosecution preparation reached the final stage, the team was acutely aware this was one of the county's most complex cases in years, yet they also knew they had never before held such a powerful and clear chain of evidence. 30 years of silence had now become a weighty indictment, one capable of bringing Grant Haverson to justice. The trial of Grant Haverson opened with the presentation of forensic evidence, one of the case's most important pillars and the portion the prosecution had prepared most thoroughly, because only science could withstand defense challenges in a nobody homicide. Before the jury, the prosecutors presented each evidence group in turn, accompanied by forensic experts, charts, digital images, and visual simulations. The first evidence group presented was the DNA from hair found in Laura's car in 1990. The BCA DNA expert explained mitochondrial DNA structure, why mtDNA persists longer than nuclear DNA in harsh environments, and the advanced PCR extraction process from hair shafts. When the comparison results appeared on the large screen, two mtDNA sequences matching 100% between the evidence hair and Grant's reference sample, the courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor emphasized the match probability exceeded 99.99%, and the hair showed violent fracture signs. Compressed keratin surface, jagged break edges, and damage patterns that only occur with forceful pulling, completely inconsistent with natural shedding. When defense counsel pressed that the hair could have shed years earlier, the expert replied firmly, the hair's location, wedged deep between the driver's seat and gear shift, was inconsistent with accidental transfer from clothing or a passenger in another seat. It indicated close contact shortly before violent removal. The second evidence group was the forest soil cluster, samples taken from Grant's old boots, and from the area where the bone fragment was recovered. The forensic geologist presented mineral analysis tables, fine particle structure, and clay composition unique to Cloquet Valley, directly compared with soil residue on Grant's boots. The match in rare mineral ratios, especially feldspar and mica in the gray-brown soil type, was described as sufficiently unique to determine origin. When defense counsel suggested Minnesota soil can be similar, the expert countered with a statewide geological map, proving the boot soil matched the bone fragment site almost perfectly but did not match forests around Duluth or the agricultural areas Grant claimed to frequent. The third forensic group, fiber analysis, was shown with images magnified hundreds of times under an electron microscope. Gray-blue fibers found in Grant's old storage box were compared to fabric from the jacket Laura wore the day she vanished. Weave structure, polyester type, late 1980 stye signature, and fiber end tearing patterns matched exactly. The forensic expert also explained friction tear, horizontal fabric damage from strong dragging or struggle. When defense counsel asked whether the fibers could come from any similar jacket, the expert pointed out this fiber type was produced only in two 1988-1989 winter jacket lines, and Laura owned one of them. Statistically, the chance of those fibers appearing coincidentally in Grant's box was essentially zero. The fourth forensic presentation was LiDAR mapping, one of the most powerful technologies used in the case. On the screen, the prosecution showed the jury a 3D map of Cloquet Valley generated by LiDAR. Experts explained how LiDAR penetrates tree canopy and detects surface distortions to centimeter accuracy. At the site where the bone fragment and pendant were found, an abnormally compressed soil area appeared clearly, with pit edges showing evidence of prior excavation and refilling years earlier. LiDAR also revealed two nearby erosion paths, gradually carrying material from the compressed area down to where the bone fragment surfaced in 2021. When the model animated 31 years of Minnesota freeze-thaw erosion cycles, the jury could watch the bone fragment migrate exactly from its original burial location to its 2021 discovery position, completely refuting the animal drag theory. LiDAR further recorded a narrow trail leading from a Forest Service road, drivable by a pickup, directly to the compressed pit. This matched the forest map seized from Grant's home, where he had circled that same route in pencil. When defense counsel tried to challenge LiDAR reliability by noting this technology didn't exist in 1990, the prosecutor immediately countered, precisely why the crime remained hidden in 1990. But in 2021, science exposed what was buried. At the close of the forensic portion, the prosecutor summarized Grant's violently pulled hair in Laura's car, Laura's jacket fibers in Grant's storage box, Cloquet Valley soil on Grant's boots, Laura's bone fragment and pendant in the forest Grant mapped, and LiDAR confirmation of digging and burial at the remains site. No single piece stands alone, the prosecutor said, but together they form an irreversible forensic structure. The jury did not need closing arguments. The science had already spoken the truth. When it was Grant Halverson's defense team's turn, their strategy was evident from the opening sentences. They did not attempt to deny the forensic evidence in its entirety. Too much of it was objective and scientifically weighty, but instead focused on the only two areas still exploitable: the incomplete remains and the possibility that the prosecution's simulated timeline could be inaccurate. Counsel rose, paced slowly before the jury, his tone calm but deliberately intended to sow doubt rather than offer a coherent alternative narrative. He began with the standard argument in nobody cases. No one, not police, not forensic experts, not a single witness can tell you they know what happened to Laura Houghton that day. You have heard only simulations and inferences, but no one saw anything, and there is no intact body to prove the mechanism or timing of death. This struck at the case's inherent weakness. The bone fragment proved Laura was dead, but revealed nothing about how, where, or exactly when she died. Defense counsel stressed that one small piece of bone cannot tell us how Laura died, where she died, or when she died. He framed this as a gap the prosecution could not close, no matter how advanced their technology. Next, counsel attacked the DNA evidence. He did not deny the MET-T DNA match, but attempted to dilute its value by suggesting unprovable alternative scenarios. He claimed the hair could have fallen into Laura's car at a completely different time, emphasizing they had been married and prior contact before 1990 could easily transfer a few hairs via clothing or personal items. When the prosecutor objected, citing Grant's own statement that he had not seen Laura for weeks before her disappearance, defense counsel simply replied, "A person's memory 30 years later may be inaccurate. Mistakes happen." Regarding the hair's violent fracture evidence, counsel argued the damage could result from environmental conditions, pressure from being trapped under the seat, or substandard 1990 evidence collection practices. The argument was scientifically weak, but the defense knew they did not need to prove anything, only to plant the smallest seed of doubt in jurors' minds. When addressing the fibers found in Grant's storage box, counsel employed the same tactic. He did not deny the similarity, but insisted the fabric was not unique, and no one proved. It came precisely from Laura's jacket. They questioned the 30-year chain of custody and hinted at possible cross-contamination, without offering any actual evidence. Even though the prosecution had shown the fabric was produced in very limited runs in the late 1980s, the defense claimed Minnesota is cold, many people owned gray-blue jackets, and many products overlapped in material. The argument again failed scientifically, but it served their core strategy, creating fog around the prosecution's certainty. When confronting the LiDAR mapping, one of the prosecution's strongest exhibits, defense counsel focused on undermining the interpretive nature of the simulation. He stated, "This technology, however modern, cannot tell us exactly what happened 31 years ago. A compressed soil area can have many causes: animal burrows, fallen trees, campers, or even a natural event. We have nothing proving Grant Halverson ever set foot there." Counsel deliberately sidestepped the detail that the map seized from Grant's home circled the exact LiDAR anomaly, instead claiming the map could belong to anyone, despite prosecution evidence showing oil residue on the map matching the type in Grant's garage. But the defense strategy went beyond forensics. The heart of their rebuttal rested on the simulated timeline. They attempted to make the prosecution timeline appear overly complex and questionable by dissecting minute by minute. They asked, how do we know Laura left the house at that exact time? How do we know she didn't change direction? How do we know the 2021 witnesses truly remember 1990 events accurately? When the prosecution countered that the timeline rested on consistent family statements and Laura's daily routine, counsel replied, routines are not always the same. They exploited the absence of 1990 traffic cameras or GPS, and the fact no one saw Laura after she left home. This was the case's genuine soft spot, a temporal gap that only forensics and logic could bridge, but never recreate with absolute certainty. The defense further claimed the red pickup could belong to anyone, and that witnesses only remembered what they believed they saw, not necessarily what they actually saw. The prosecutor objected repeatedly, but defense counsel had achieved their goal, planting in jurors' minds the slightest doubt that the simulated timeline might be flawed or incomplete. Finally, they repeated one point endlessly: no intact body, no mechanism of death, no clear time of death. They closed their rebuttal with everything the prosecution has offered is a story built from fragments. But a story is not proof. The defense team understood perfectly the gap between forensic weight and legal truth in court, creating reasonable doubt. Just enough is sufficient to save their client. What they could not control, however, was the overwhelming cumulative force of the entire evidence chain. And the jury, sitting silently throughout, had heard everything: forensics, timeline, behavior, and the contradictions Grant could never explain. The defense's tactics made noise, but they did not create an exit. When both sides concluded their arguments, the trial entered the deliberation phase. The jury was led into a private room, taking with them more than 30 hours of expert testimony, forensic maps, interrogation transcripts, physical evidence, and every document introduced during the nearly 3-week trial. They had one single question to answer: whether the chain of evidence, even without an intact body, was strong enough to conclude that Grant Halverson committed first-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The initial discussion revolved around the point the defense had tried hardest to plant doubt about: the absence of an intact body. A few jurors admitted this had initially given them pause. But as they reviewed the forensic framework presented by the prosecution, the pieces gradually fell together in a logic that was hard to deny: bone fragments identified by DNA as belonging to Laura. Strands of Grant's hair showing signs of being forcibly pulled, found in Laura's car. Fibers from the type of jacket Laura was wearing, discovered in Grant's storage box. Cloquet Valley soil on his boots, and LiDAR mapping proving that the location where the remains were found had once contained a pit dug and filled in the early 1990s. When one juror asked, "Do we have any evidence that anyone else was present at those locations?" the entire group shook their heads. There was not a single piece of exculpatory evidence pointing to third-party involvement. They then revisited Grant's constantly shifting statements, especially the direct contradictions between his 1990 statements, his 2021 statements, and the physical evidence. One juror said, "If he were innocent, there would be no reason to change his story 6 times in a single interview." Another added, "Nobody keeps a box related to the woods, containing fibers from the victim's jacket, for 30 years unless they're terrified of what's inside being discovered." When they examined the reconstructed timeline, the point the defense had tried hardest to undermine, they saw that although there were no security cameras in 1990, the model still rested on hard data, the time Laura left home confirmed by family, the distance from home to Lakeview Pet boarding, the window when Grant had no provable alibi, witness statements about the red pickup, and the route simulation that only Grant's vehicle could have completed within that morning's time frame. One juror remarked, "It's not perfect, but it's accurate enough, and more importantly, only one person fits the timeline." After 8 straight hours of deliberation, longer than expected, but not overly tense, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Not a single member believed the defense had created reasonable doubt. On the contrary, all agreed that the forensic chain had reconstructed the truth, even without a complete body. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the air became so quiet that every footstep could be heard. Grant sat at the defense table, face rigid, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if awaiting something he already knew but still hoped to escape. The judge asked the jury, "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, holding the sheet with the decision. His voice was clear, firm, and unwavering. "We, the jury, having considered all the evidence, find the defendant, Grant Halverson, guilty of murder in the first degree, in connection with the death of Laura Houghton." A few soft exhales came from the prosecution table. Laura's family began crying silently. Grant showed no clear emotion, but his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The verdict was recorded according to procedure, and the judge pronounced the sentence for the crime of murder in the first degree under Minnesota law. A no-body homicide proven through linked forensic evidence, concealment behavior, and logical timeline. The defendant, Grant Halverson, is sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. No one in the courtroom said another word. Silence lingered for several seconds, as if to fully absorb the weight of the sentence. For the jury, the certainty came from the fact that every piece of forensic evidence, from physical items to behavior, pointed to a single conclusion. And when science spoke, they believed they were not wrong. Grant was handcuffed and led out of the courtroom. 31 years after Laura Houghton vanished on her way to work, justice had finally been served, based not on confessions or eyewitnesses, but on science, data, and a logical structure that no counter-argument could dismantle. Once the sentence was pronounced, and Grant Halverson was officially convicted, the Duluth Police Department and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension began compiling a comprehensive final report on the entire investigation. A long, detailed document intended to answer 2 major questions: why the 1990 investigation failed, and why the case succeeded in 2021, after more than 3 decades of deadlock. In the first part of the report, investigators analyzed the factors that prevented the original investigation from moving forward. The biggest limitation was 1990 forensic technology. DNA was barely used in missing persons cases, fiber analysis was primitive, and there was no terrain scanning technology, like LiDAR, to detect tiny ground disturbances. Gloves, rope, maps, hair, all the physical evidence collected at the time could only be logged, not deeply analyzed. This meant police could only build theories based on behavior and statements, both of which are easily skewed. The second major failure factor was Minnesota's harsh winter weather. Snow, thawing ice, and high winds erased traces within hours. The routes Laura might have taken were obscured, tire tracks faded, footprints vanished, and any outdoor physical clues simply did not last long enough to be documented. In the vast, rugged Superior National Forest, spanning hundreds of square miles, searches could cover breadth but not depth. Every tree and narrow trail could not be checked. Third, in 1990, police lacked the modern forensic mindset and deep understanding of offender behavior patterns in domestic violence-related disappearances. Concepts like offender returns or geographical profiling were not yet common, so signals from Laura and Grant's relationship and the level of risk Grant posed were not properly recognized. Another contributing cause was the absence of centralized databases. Paper files were easily lost, hard to cross-reference, and could not be shared between agencies as easily as today. Torn forest maps, tiny fabric fibers, hair samples, everything had been preserved, but there were no tools to connect them to Grant's behavior. Taken together, these factors created an incomplete picture that prevented 1990 investigators from proving anything beyond suspicion. In contrast, the second part of the report explained why 2021 succeeded. The most critical factor was the giant leap in forensic technology. Mitochondrial DNA could be extracted from bone fragments weathered for over 30 years. Microscopic fiber analysis could identify jacket type, year of manufacture, and origin. Hair fracture patterns could indicate violent contact. Soil analysis could pinpoint where a mud sample came from. Most crucially, LiDAR became a game changer. It revealed a burial pit filled in the 1990s that the naked eye or earlier search teams could never have detected. By reading the terrain centimeter by centimeter, investigators finally understood how the bone fragments ended up where they did in 2021 and where Laura's body had originally been placed. Technology was the backbone, but people were the driving force behind the 2021 success. Thanks to digitization of records in 2011, investigators could easily cross-reference every historical piece of data, from family statements and old forest maps to search reports and descriptions of Grant's vehicle. When new clues emerged, the bone fragments and pendant, the team used cognitive interview techniques to revive witnesses' memories and uncover the red pickup that witnesses had previously recalled only vaguely. Modern interviewing methods recreated memories without leading witnesses, allowing details buried for 3 decades to resurface in their correct place on the timeline. Additionally, contemporary behavioral investigation models showed that Grant's signs, from changing his story in 2021 to monitoring forest areas during the 3 weeks he was watched, perfectly matched the profile of someone who had concealed a crime scene. Another key to success was interagency coordination. Duluth PD, BCA, DNA labs, geologists, LiDAR experts, and prosecutors all worked in sync, each in their area of expertise with rapid feedback loops. 30 years earlier, agencies operated in silos with slow data sharing. In 2021, every clue went into the same integrated analysis system. When the timeline model was rebuilt, every piece of evidence, hair, fabric, soil, maps, statements, fell into place within a logical framework. And that framework was what turned a cold case into one solved by forensics rather than a confession or direct witness. In the final section of the report, Duluth PD described the case as stark proof of the enormous gap between investigative capabilities in 1990 and 2021. They noted that the 1990 failure was not due to negligence or lack of dedication, but to the limitations of the era. Conversely, the 2021 success reflected the power of scientific progress and the persistence of multiple generations of investigators. The Laura Houghton case file, after more than 3 decades, was finally closed as fully resolved. But in the very last note of the report, one line was written clearly: "Justice may come late, but it is never too late when science and persistence are put in the right place." The story of the Laura Houghton cold case, solved after more than 3 decades thanks to modern forensic technology, clearly reflects issues American society still faces today: domestic violence that is minimized, victims left isolated, and an investigative system that, despite progress, sometimes cannot act quickly enough without tangible evidence. The fact that Laura lived in fear multiple times due to Grant's controlling and threatening behavior, yet there was not enough evidence in 1990 for law enforcement to intervene decisively, is a stark reminder that violence exists even when there are no visible injuries or physical fights. Behavioral control, stalking, threats, and psychological pressure, the very red flags Grant displayed, are dangerous indicators that domestic violence experts in the United States today warn must be taken seriously. Another important detail of the story is the silence that lasted more than 30 years, largely because technology at the time could not analyze hair, fabric fibers, or forest soil. This reflects the reality that far too many victims in the U.S. have been lost simply because science was not yet able to help them. Yet thanks to advances in forensics, from mtDNA and microfiber analysis to LiDAR, the case was cracked in 2021. The ultimate lesson is that science can recover the truth, but preventing tragedy must start in the community. Laura's story is a reminder that support for people at risk must happen the moment warning signs appear, not after a disappearance or obvious injury. If you, a friend, or a loved one is experiencing signs of control or threats, please reach out to a domestic violence hotline, community support organization, or law enforcement. The 31 years of silence in this story prove that the truth cannot always wait. Timely intervention can save a life, before science has to search for them 3 decades later. Thank you for following this story to the end, where justice for Laura Houghton was finally found after more than 3 decades through the power of science and persistence. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep joining us as we explore more emotional case-breaking journeys, and we'll see you in the next video.